We want to have this conversation before we, let's do the. I don't say that. That'll be better. We will call the meeting to order. Yes. All right, morning, everyone. Go ahead. Good morning. Good morning, Casey. How are you? Yes. Before we get officially kicked off, I'd like to, well, y'all all know Kirk, but I'll let him talk about some logistics this morning or for this afternoon, and then we'll officially start the meeting and I'll call it to order and we'll go from there. So Kirk. I'm just gonna pass it right over to Kathy.
Oh yeah, great. So lots of you have failed last minute and you're just gonna regret it, but those of you who are joining us on the paddle today, we are gonna leave from here. We're gonna drive straight to where we're gonna actually
Tom and John, those of us online just lost audio. We can't hear you now.
yesterday, so we should be good.
Good job.
Yeah, thank you for doing that.
All right, well, thank you, you Patrick and Catherine for putting this all together, hosting it. I was one of those, I had to bail a couple of weeks ago because I had made a promise to my daughter that we would go see Weezer this evening, and I really think I could get up the river and get to Weezer in time. So we'll be enjoying the Blue album this evening. If the folks that go on the trip have a good time and it's deemed that folks would like to try to do it again, I think there was a tentative date. If it rained out of labor, I'll go ahead and suggest we look at that because I'd really like to get out on the river myself. If not, I will talk to Patrick and schedule that on my own. So, but with that said, any questions about heading out there today? All right, then with that, I'd like to call the meeting to order, just a couple minutes late, but I appreciate everybody's time. Today we will be reviewing chapter 4 and 8 comments. I will tell you, your chair has not submitted his chapter 4 comments. I apologize. There's just been a few things going on, so that will be a good discussion. And of course, the heavy work we're doing now on development of the plan recommendations, we will continue down that path. Really looking forward to that. I think we got a lot accomplished last time, and we will continue that good work. And then again, the folks that get to kind of the fortunate few will get to enjoy the Saluda firsthand. So I hope everybody's looked at the agenda. I would accept a motion to approve said agenda. Motion made, a second. Second. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Any nays? Hearing no nays, we approve the agenda. Approval of the August 22nd meetings and summary. I entertain a motion on that. My question on that. I have a motion and a second. We'll go with the same second. Any discussion? Anything need to be discussed about those? All right. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Opposed? I'm sorry, I'm asking for right hands. Is anybody online voting opposed?
Just thumbs up.
Very good. Thank you very much. Those meeting minutes are approved. Housekeeping, y'all been here a few times, so hopefully everything's familiar for everybody. Does anybody need the Yes Network password? Should be programmed into most phones by now. Hearing none, I won't put it on the video. Anything else we need to discuss before we get into the middle of things?
So Casey, Robert Hanley, if you have a moment, I do have a question for our friends at DES.
Certainly.
I opened up DES's River Basin Planning website, and it does not appear that the organization that DNR had presented on their website carried over to DES. So for instance, I could not easily find the Saluda Basin Council on DES's website. And if I am missing something, that's my bad, but I would like to ask DES perhaps at our next meeting just to go through how to navigate the Basin Planning Council website that they have created.
It's there, so we can go through if we need to.
Did you hear that, Robert? They'll be glad to if necessary. It seems like I was on it last week. I can't remember how I navigated to it. I think I just Google search Saluda RBC and I was able to get there. So yeah.
Yeah, I can provide some links back to the invite through Tom's email to the group.
That'd be great.
Maybe between now and next meeting, and if we need to go through it, glad to spend some time doing that.
Very good. Thank you.
Works for me.
All right. Anything else? All right. Well, with that, as y'all know, John has taken some much deserved vacation, and he's turned it over into the very capable hands of Kirk hands. We'll get him to lead us through the rest of the day.
Thanks, Casey. Good to see you all again. I've been down here for a few of the meetings. John and I talked quite a bit last week before he left about what we hope to accomplish today. And I think the message is this is a pretty low stress meeting. Could be looked at as exactly the opposite. But we want to talk through some of the recommendations that we've started to talk through, started to formulate, started to put words to, and see if we can come to agreement on some of them. Probably not all of them, but decide what we want to do with the ones that we don't necessarily agree on completely. So I hope to make some progress on that. I don't expect us to get all the way through. We have next month, and we've got plenty of time to work through these, and it's one of the most important parts of the planning process. So we'll get as far as we can. As we get to each section, I'll kind of give you a preview of what we've talked about, so you can have things in your mind. But that's where we like to spend our time. We will spend a little time also reviewing comments from chapter 4 and 8. They are voluminous. Thank you, Catherine. Many of them we have addressed or are addressing or are acknowledging as clarifications, which we will address. Some of them we'll talk about today and get everybody's thoughts on. And probably won't get to every one of them today, but we can certainly finish that up.
I hope others send some in. Wasn't just me.
A lot of them had your name on it, but that's all right.
I'm gonna for Casey's tardiness.
Yeah, I may have equaled her number, so
Tom, can you just let us know who on the RBC is right now?
Yeah, we got a lot of folks online today. Devin Orr just came into the meeting. We've also got Robert Hanley, Phil Fragapane, Rhett Templeton, Kevin Miller, Larry Nates, and Eddie Owen. I think I got everybody there.
Safe to say we have a quorum.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Gone through that. Couple housekeeping items. John just wanted to put these in front of you every once in a while. We don't need to talk about these right now. But just a reminder that things have come up over the course of your discussions that are worth coming back to, perhaps. Some of them are ongoing, but just so we don't forget them, as is often the case with parking lots, groups like this that last a couple of years. Just wanted to put these in front of you. I'll read through them quickly, unless there's any major need to discuss them. We can, but engagement with the public with this process, how that's going to work, that's sort of ongoing. We do have public meetings, I think, in the works. Engagement of public officials from municipalities to promote the plan. That's still needs to be done. And one of the things I wanted to just say about that is, as we think about building advocacy or building consensus for this plan and developing recommendations that have pros and cons, what we hope is that in different ways, each of you will find certain things about the plan to advocate, not just support your name to, but advocate for. And that will be important as we move forward. Development and maintenance of a public facing data clearinghouse for all things Saluda. That's in the parking lot because it's a monumental task, but worth talking about. I think we actually have some ideas to start thinking about that in our session later on. Funding the implementation. We will solve that in 5 or 10 minutes. Discussing some data gaps. We will talk about data gaps today. It's part of our discussion. Recommendations to consider non-FERC regulated dams and how they impact recreation. John and our team to share a general PowerPoint with the RBC. I know he's working on that, something that you could use as a template for your own outreach. Idea for public engagement, student friendly. Love that idea. We as a firm, we love to get students involved in some of these large scale projects. They really benefit from it. The faculty benefits from it, and we and all of you benefit from some of their perspectives and kind of encouraging them into this field so that 20 years from now, they're here with us and doing this kind of work. Optional idea for a talk. Asking the state representative to speak about current policies. I understand some of those discussions may be ongoing. Legal petition for safe yield conversation. We'll be talking about safe yield today. Some that may come up. And then an RBC letter requesting that the legislative approved surface water study committee collaborate with the 8 RBCs. These are things that there'll be a lot of overlap with the topics and recommendations we're talking about today. But again, things that we put in the parking lot, if we can take them out of the parking lot after today's meeting, that's great. But we will have plenty of time in this process. You guys are ahead of schedule a little bit to deal with these as we go on. Any questions or discussion about any of these? Anything that anybody feels need to be prioritized as part of our policy discussion that may not be there already? Okay, let's move on. Any comments from members of the public or agency members? And that extends to online attendees as well. All right, hearing none. Let me just check acoustics. Can everybody in the room hear me okay? All right, throw things if you can. I can duck pretty quickly. Can everybody online hear okay?
One thumbs up.
One thumbs up, so at least one person can be correct. Hopefully that continues.
2 thumbs up.
All right.
Snowball.
Let's start talking quietly. Okay. First order of business today is to review chapters 4 and 8, some of the comments we received. Chapter 4 is, you remember, the summary of current and projected demand in the Saluda Basin. Chapter 8 is the drought response. There are, I believe, hundreds of comments, and we thank you for that, for the diligence you put into this. We have a comment log with each and every one of them and our response to that, which we will make available to this group. Many of them, as I said, are acknowledgements, they're clarifications that we've incorporated or editorial, and others are substantive changes to the plan. We went through and collected just a few of those more substantive to share today. And Grace, I know that you're on the phone, if I can put you on the spot for a minute. Do you want to just summarize how you went through those comments and identified these, and then we can talk about them as a group a little bit?
Hi, yeah, sure. Good morning, everyone. So I reviewed the comments that we had received as of last week. I understand some new ones have come through since then. But I basically just went through, and there's a lot of comments that are smaller editorial comments, some asking for clarification that we will respond to, that I think everyone will agree with without any discussion needed. Then just try to go through and see if there are any comments that have a greater impact or could be worthy of discussion or just came up a few times. So worth mentioning to the group, just in case anyone else is seeing the same thing when they go through and review the chapters. So starting with chapter 4, there were a number of comments on the groundwater and just asking for additional clarification on the groundwater demands. And a big piece of that is just that the groundwater use is so small in the Saluda. It's less than 0.1% of the total water demands. So we've just assumed that those demands will stay constant into the future, since it really is not going to have a large impact on the demands overall. And in one of the earlier presentations to the RBC, it was shown that groundwater usage has been pretty consistent over the last few years and maybe even going down a little bit. So keeping it constant into the future is a somewhat conservative approach, but probably pretty reasonable. On a similar vein, the next bullet here was there was a suggestion to just show surface water on the figures. There's a number of figures for each water use category where we show the projected demands over the planning horizon, and we show it for surface water and groundwater. And it just includes a note on each figure that groundwater is too small to visibly see in each of the figures. So there's a recommendation to just make those figures say surface water only, and note in the text that the groundwater usage is so small it's not included.
Okay with everybody?
So
if it's really just a sliver in a graph that you can't see, we'll note it in the text as a number. We're getting hit in space.
okay, great. And then another point to clarify about groundwater usage was just related to the permits and registrations. So we'll make this even more clear in the text, but the groundwater permits have a usage associated with it, but the groundwater registrations don't have a usage associated with it. So what we did was just report the recent usage for the groundwater registered users, but it's not quite fair to say that that is the registered amount, because it's not that they're limited to that amount that they've been using recently. It's just what the current usage is for the registered groundwater users.
Who are those registered with? Because we're not a capacity use area, so. Is that a DES registration or an ag registration? I wasn't sure.
It's still registered with DES. So the Piedmont, as part of the capacity use regs, is a registration area, so all line up. They're not a capacity use area, you're correct.
So that's
they
just
register.
Lexington for us. A little bit of Lexington County for us, correct?
Yeah, very small amount, yes.
Yeah, it looked like on that one chart, and I made it, that there were other registrations for groundwater, and I couldn't place where those would have been. So I made a comment in my notes.
Yeah, we'll look into that.
Yeah.
Did you submit that as a comment on the draft? Okay,
Yeah.
we will look into that.
Okay, and the groundwater permits were missing from that figure, so that was correctly identified by a reviewer, so we've corrected that too. Right now, it just shows the groundwater registrations. All right, any other comment or discussion on groundwater?
Can you talk about table 4.3 and just like why, like how we can make it more clear based on what you just said? Because now I'm even more confused about how the map should be working across that table and then on the bottom half.
Okay, Yeah, we can try to clarify that further in the text, but for anyone that doesn't have it in front of you, which probably is all of you, table 4.3 is the summary of the permitted and registered use in the Saluda Basin. So the top part goes through the total permits and registrations for each water use category. For surface and groundwater, and then the bottom half of the table is just showing the percentage of that permitted and registered amount that is currently in use. So for the groundwater registrations that's probably the part that's confusing. So for example, for golf courses, there.
I'm wondering if it would help the group to share your screen real quick to show this.
Can I do that? Let me see.
You can stop your share, so I have to stop. Yeah. I'll make that for you. Just in case. Okay, Grace, you should be able to share it.
Okay. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes.
Okay. So this is table 4.3. So what I was just saying was the top half of it is just summarizing the permitted and registered amounts for each water use category for surface water, groundwater, and the total. And then the bottom half of the graph here refers back to the previous section in the chapter, which is the current use for each of these categories. And it's just a percentage of the current use over the total permitted and registered amount. Just to provide a sense of how much of the permitted and registered amount in the basin is actually being used, and how much is still unused.
So I was also very confused by this narrative. And I agree with Catherine. I think there needs to be some language that clarifies what's going on. I did not add this to my comments, but I almost think that a more logical progression for this section would be starting with the permitted and registered users to show what the withdrawal would be, potential withdrawal would be if all permitted and registered users were withdrawing to their allowable limits, and then follow that with actual use. This seems to start backwards. It starts with, here's what's actually being taken out based on reports. And I also didn't understand why those reports stop at 2019, since here it is 2023-4, and we should at least have a couple of more years of data in DES's files.
So are you suggesting that the overall format of the chapter, instead of starting with the current water demand, the first section should be the permitted and registered use?
That's my thought, is you start with what is permitted and registered, and then you go to what is based on reporting, what is being used. But thus, I'm not saying that needs to be done. Those are my thoughts. And if the RBC feels this is fine, I am more than willing to accept this current.
Is the other plans, is that consistent with the framework to be in that order, or does the framework not address?
It's consistent with the other plans. I don't know if the framework prescribes the sequence. It prescribes the content, both of these being in the chapter. I don't know if it prescribes sequence. I would doubt it.
Yeah, I'd have to look back at that. It might prescribe the sequence, it might not, but yes, it is consistent with how we've done the other plans.
But, okay, so is the math, are these numbers actually right or are they wrong? Because that's the part that I'm still like trying to understand, like, the totals don't.
There were errors that you identified in an earlier table, I think, or maybe it was that table.
I mean, like,
yeah, sorry. So up in this portion, there were errors in some of these numbers. I think we had updated the permitted amount, but not the total, or vice versa. So that is being fixed right now.
The numbers were right. I need a lot more explanation because math doesn't work that way.
Yes, yep. No, you're correct. There were math errors in this table. Apologize for that.
Correct math. Does anybody have a strong opinion about sequence? Permitted use versus the actual, or the actual and followed by the permitted? Is that an important consideration here?
Just simplify it as much as possible.
Okay, great. So why don't we talk about that offline?
Yep.
And if the other plans are organized this way, then I would suggest we not reorganize this plan just to address one particular basin member's comments. I think it is more important that the plans present a consistent narrative.
But I see your point that the narrative can be more persuasive in the opposite direction. So Grace and I will talk about that and maybe get back to the RBC with some suggestions. Maybe the introduction to the section can introduce that concept of permitted use and then. Okay. Okay, Grace, I'm just taking some notes.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. I think that's all on this table that I was just sharing. I hope it will make more sense when the math makes sense. Okay, so then the next major point was on the demand projections. And there were some comments about noting how the projections are shown starting in 2025 rather than 2020. And then there was also a question on why the projections in 2025 are starting at different points. So just wanted to clarify a point about this, that these demand projections are not really forecasts from the end of our data point, but rather they are models of potential water use in different scenarios. So in many cases, they're based on a unit use rate per user. So we may have the same number of users at the starting point, but then we are applying either a high unit use to them or a more moderate unit use. So that's how you can get a different demand starting point at the beginning of the projections. And we're also just showing the demand models by themselves starting in 2025 rather than including any of the historic data, just so there isn't a break in this graph. Because it's a model based on unit use rates, you might see that there is a jump up or a jump down from the historic use. So we just thought it provided a cleaner narrative to just show the projection portion of the demand time series.
Grace, I'll add to that we've tried in some of the other basins to blend the current use and projected use, and it's very difficult for people to understand where one stops and the other begins. And even when we've used different colors and different lines, it's just been very confusing to do that. And there's been a lot of explanation required. And I think there was one of the RBCs said, just use the forecasts and start in 2025 so that it's clear that all of the data is a forecast amount. So that's sort of why we have done it this way. But if there's a strong opinion to show it, other ways, that's something we can talk about. But in the context of scenarios, I would ask, is there really a lot of need to show where the forecast begins and where the current use ends?
So I was one of the commenters on this. I'm assuming that you all have had a chance to look at my comments, and I understand now why the process is this way. I think it needs to be explained more clearly. And I also think it needs to be explained more clearly that it's based on current demand rather than permitted and registered allowable use. And the reason I bring that up is there is one groundwater withdrawal, one of the public water systems has a permit to withdraw 4 million gallons a day, but they're only withdrawing a fraction of that, like a percent of their permitted. So again, I think it needs to be clearly explained to the reader.
I guess like my comment is. We have in table 4-1 that our current demand is 311.9 million gallons per day today. And that data is only through 2019, not including the last 5 years. And then you go to 4.5, which has our projected, and our projected for 2025 is 261.2, which is less than 311.9. So how are we projecting in 4 months to be using 50 less million gallons per day than we were 5 years ago?
Yeah, I think it has to do with the unit rates. Alice, do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a zinger.
Not to put you on the spot.
Like, it's like, this whole chapter is rough for me because the math just doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense to me, and we've been through this whole process, we all just like, I just want it to be approachable for people reading this outside of our group.
Absolutely. So, for some context, CDM, we passed the job of chapter 4 on to CDM Smith without preparing our own report on the projections for these basins. We did that for the Eddystone, the Broad. We then lost staff, we're unable to replace them. So we kind of just wanted to keep moving. So yeah, great job on the table. That's what I'm saying. No, but these are, I'm kind of joking there, but these are serious questions and I think they need serious answers and I'm gonna have to review that. But I will say that the demand projections are calibrated. So for the Saluda, do you remember when we provided the model inputs?
I don't recall.
Because they're with the most up-to-date data as of that day. So DES only gets the data in January for the past year.
Yeah.
But if I gave projections in March, they had January, if I gave them in January, I think I gave them on like New Year's. And I think actually everyone in the Saluda had reported. And I did update. So there was 2023 data.
Okay. In the current demands.
In the demands. Now, current scenario, okay, we got to figure this current scenario is an average base, a mean average that CDM Smith does for the SWAM inputs. Okay. My projections are a median. So if there are high outliers, that will drive the average up, but it won't really affect the median.
Right.
So that's why the moderate demand scenario sometimes does come in less than the current use average scenario. But the high demand scenario should be more. And I believe we evaluate all of our planning results on the high demand scenario, which is based on the maximum monthly withdrawal.
Yeah, the
So-
high is 530, so that's higher. That
Right.
that number makes sense to me.
That's the sort of CYA numbers there. It's the high demand kind of, I hope covers all the bases. There's the reason we don't project based on permits is because I don't know of any social, economic, environmental causes that would cause people to pull their permit limit in all scenarios. I can't say it's unrealistic. It's not me doing it, but I just don't know why that would happen. If we want to create it, we have the permit limit scenario. If we want to look at other scenarios, that's great. I hope we can do that. And I will look further into, what exactly is the difference between current use and moderate scenario for 2025.
John will probably have some more insight into that than I have too.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. Doesn't make sense, right?
Because the moderate does not refer to just moderate demand, it refers to moderate increases.
Right, it's moderate growth. Based on median historical demand and then, projected growth rates based on the sector.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, Alex, John, and three of us and Grace could probably talk.
I look at the current use scenario as a great check because every time when I develop SWAM inputs, I'm like, okay, well, they've got numbers that are totally independent of mine. So I can look at it and I look at them for every user, but I don't add them all up and say, what's the total difference? That's too far or whatever, So I can get more back. Sometimes it might just be one user. It might be the way Greenville is portrayed, for example, between the two basins, can have a big difference. We'll
That's why we asked you to read these.
We're gonna need to have a reread of chapter 4. Just is my vote. I don't know if everybody agrees with that, but we need another opportunity to, I think, read that chapter.
And it's honestly, it's a challenging topic.
Yeah.
Because it is trying to predict the future in a range of potential plausible envelopes. We're seeing in parts of the country, demand is going down as population is going up, and passive conservation, more efficient appliances that just get replaced whenever your dishwasher breaks, you use less water. A lot of these to the order of 15-20% over 10 to 15 years. So crazy things are happening with demand, and it is not. It's probably more of an art than a science. Is that fair to say?
We went through a process, with stakeholders to develop the methods, and I'm just trying to apply them. I'm not trying to bring a whole lot of judgment into it. When there is some other consideration, I try to just make a note of that.
Right. In this case, you've applied the method, or we've applied the method, and there's an inconsistency with what you're seeing, the most recent actual demand, and we'd like to reconcile it.
Well, and if it's gonna stay that way, we just need to articulate why it is that way.
Understand why, right?
If the numbers are wrong, then we need to fix them.
I guess there's a reason for it.
Yeah.
Because we see this kind of thing frequently.
As technology's gotten better over time, would the sources that are using water aren't they doing a better job keeping up with the water usage?
So, for example, with industry, maybe I should let the RBC talk more, but with industry, we project growth because of economic growth in industry. But if I look at realistic historical water use in the industrial sector, it's been declining since as far as data. They're getting more and more efficient every single year. More industries come in sometimes, so there's bumps, but that's the general trend. So by projecting growth, almost ridiculous growth, I think I tried to make that clear when I introduced the projections. The industry is probably one of the least likely, high growth situations. But by projecting that, we're trying to cover our bases to make sure we have enough water. Right, so that's the idea. So when there's something that the moderate scenario looks too low, I definitely want to take that into account. There's legitimate, like for example, if we saw a shortage, one of the first things we should consider is, are we just not going to get more efficient? Because we probably are, right? So then we address the shortage. But I'm not going to bake that efficiency into my projections before we look into that.
You just said, I don't know, sort of heard it, just made me think of something. You said something about industry, something about their projections of flow not being incredible, or?
My projections of growth are high.
Okay.
For industry. And it's not only is it high, it's kind of arbitrary because there's these different sectors. And so I get the projections from the Energy Information Agency, it's a federal thing, and they do like 10 or 15 year projections. And is this, so okay, I've got a company that makes textiles out of plastic. They also make like some other lubricants and such. Is that a miscellaneous manufacturing projected to grow like 4% a year? Or is that a textile company projected to decline at 0.5% a year? That makes a huge difference when I extend it 50 years. We're talking just ridiculous differences based on which industry is this, which sector is this industry.
It's just that we're seeing some numbers thrown around that for these data centers are just, to me, mind-boggling for usage. And it's just seeing with the industry in general, what we're seeing is, high, and it's some high numbers that just, I would never have thought about, 10 years ago, that we're seeing thrown our way right now. I just want to make sure we're getting for that, because I just see with AI and stuff happening, we're going to see more heavy multi-million gallon a day popping up more frequently.
And so, I'm sorry. So getting back to the projection work that Alex has done, and it was one of my comments, is that report going to be an appendix in our plan, or how is that heavily referenced somewhere in our plan? So when people have these questions of, oh, where'd that come, they can go look at that document. And I know that document in one form is out on the web. I don't know if that form has been tweaked, or how do we make sure that in 3 years, when somebody else is sitting in our seats, and where these come from, they can go back to this data set and revisit it.
I'm not sure how we've done that in the other plans, the other basins. I know we've tried to describe the methodology as best we can in text. But have there been links to the actual separate reports, Alex?
So for the Edisto and Broad, we had separate reports, and since then, we haven't made separate reports yet.
Okay.
So. All right.
It is worth cutting. Aren't you glad you came, Alex? Glad you're here.
Well, I'm glad we're having a conversation about projections, because I don't feel good if I talk about projections and no one says anything. Clearly, no one's listening. There's no reason that I would know what's gonna happen in 50 years. We didn't really foresee a bunch of data crunching centers coming in 2018 when we were developing these methods. So the conversation is the most important thing. Everyone at this table thinking, Alex doesn't know what he's talking about, I need to dig into this. You're thinking you do need to dig in. We all need to think, what is the future of water use? Are we representing it correctly? Do your due diligence and convince yourself. And if there's anything I can help, okay, put together a report, fine.
And it's a question of assumptions. It's not a question of knowing what you're talking about. It's a question of making articulate, thoughtful assumptions that people can agree on, that jive with what we've seen, what we can expect, and the document. So I think that's
a lot of lending.
Yeah. Let's move on to chapter 8. Just keep this moving, if that's okay. Grace, do you want to talk us through that a little bit? Chapter 8.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I was just thinking on the last discussion too, as we move into talking about recommendations, Alex was describing how he's just applying a methodology that was developed by the stakeholder group. So it could be a consideration of whether that methodology needs revisiting in the next round of planning or something like that. Just a thought. Okay, so chapter 8. Chapter 8 was on drought response. And there were less comments on chapter 8. A lot of them were smaller, suggesting some reorganization or simplifying the summaries of all of the community's different drought plans. So a lot can be easily addressed and rectified by us as we're editing in response to these comments. A couple of things that could be worth discussion are a portion of the chapter talks about the responsibilities of the RBC related to drought. And these actually came from the framework, but I think it is worthy of discussion of whether the RBC actually has the budget and authority or a way to carry out these responsibilities. And two of the points that were brought up were related to the RBC's ability to collect hydrologic information. Do they have the budget and authority to do that? And I think this one can be addressed by saying that the chapter states that the RBC will be responsible for doing this with support of DES. And I think you could think about that as part of this planning process. Hydrologic information was collected and presented to the RBC through these meetings. And the development of this plan. Does that make sense, or is there something within the collection of hydrologic information that you haven't seen through this process that you would need to see? Or does that clarification make sense that this is a responsibility of the RBC with support of DES?
And just to make sure we're focusing on the chapter that summarizes the drought response. We're not into the recommendations yet.
Yes.
That whole other section of discussion on what your responsibilities and priorities might be going forward. But in this case, what do you feel the RBC has done during this planning process to collect, use hydrologic information in the context of drought response?
I guess I still don't love the verbiage because I feel like it should be with support from the RBC, the Office of Climate or the Climate Office and DES will do the following because we aren't even necessarily funded as a group to continue convening beyond this process. So how can that responsibility lie on our plate to do that? Thoughts? this is my comment, so I'm still the one talking. Who else has ideas?
Well, I think we need to, again, through our recommendations and where we see the plan finalizing and what we as individuals see the role of an RBC moving forward. You know, is this going to somehow become a formal body that has something backing it? A funding source or something to help us, the RBC, do what we say we're going to do in the plan. So right now, we don't, we're not a 501(c)(3), we're not a government agency. We're a gaggle of folks getting together and talking about how we can voluntarily make a plan that hopefully the state will listen to. And it's a very honorable and needed effort. That's kind of what it is right now. You know, I think there's a lot of us that envision it becoming something different moving forward, where it is a formal group that carries some authority. And we'll just have to see where we go with the recommendations on how that plan, you know, pans out. I don't know if the RBC is going to become a scientific group where they're worried about doing studies in the basin to look at how hydrological impacts impact our basin. You know, the Florida basin to have that. Texas and the way they do basin planning has that. But it remains to be seen if anything will be developed in South Carolina to do that. That's kind of what part of our task is do we have a vision of what this group and the others should be in state water planning? And how do we make those recommendations? So I think with regards to drought, the best we can do moving forward right now as things stand is make recommendations that during drought, folks get together and work for the betterment of their community.
We would listen to what you're both saying. Would it be fair to say in this chapter that during the course of the planning process, with the assistance of DES, this RBC has collected hydrologic data and has looked at drought response plans throughout the basin as the basis of some of the recommendations that we will make in this plan. And that going forward, that role will likely evolve, but it is yet uncertain. And maybe in the recommendations, we address how that role could evolve.
Yeah. Well, I also don't, like those two lines, those responsibilities are not articulated in verbatim in the statewide watershed planning framework. If they're worded slightly differently, maybe, but I just did Control F and they're not there. So it's not from the framework.
Okay, I'll double check where that came from.
Thanks, Grace.
Okay.
Okay, then the next point for discussion was, let me just pull up the language here about the RBC liaison. So Chapter 8 right now says that the Saluda RBC will communicate drought conditions and responses within the basin through a designated RBC liaison to the Drought Response Committee. And there had been discussion of potentially having a member of the RBC always on the Drought Response Committee. And I think that came up in the last meeting, and there was some question as to whether that was actually feasible or whether there were other requirements for the DRC where you wouldn't be able to ensure that an RBC member is on the DRC. So we just wanted to come back to that discussion and decide if we want to leave in the language here about a liaison, which is what we have done for the other plans, or revisit the recommendation of an RBC member on the DRC and have the communication be through that avenue.
So I think the question is the group comfortable leaving in the fairly consistent text with other ways that we designate a liaison, or do you want to take it further than that in the recommendations? And we can talk about that when we get there later today.
I think it's fine to leave it in. And periodically hoping her crowd or needing people to serve anyway. So just if the Basin committee people would keep on and volunteer, if you got time, that'd be the way to do it without mandating. Because there's different sections, kind of like our group, ag represented, utilities represented, industry represented. So if you have time, and you're interested, sign up.
Yeah, it's a prescribed, legally, they've got to have this makeup on the drought response committee. I think part of that discussion was, it seemed like a lot of the basins already had somebody in their basin on the drought response committee. So we would encourage that to continue. To say an RBC member must be on the committee would require that law to change on how they're made up. Now, a recommendation may be, if that law is ever under review, you may want that. But I think it was to be a little more nebulous on, like Patrick was saying, if we can get somebody who sits on the basin, that would be a good logical liaison to be on the committee if the position opens. Because a lot of the requirements for the drought response committee are similar to ours. You know, somebody from ag, somebody from municipality, somebody from water. So I think we could align that fairly easily.
Yeah, we can always invite them to participate in every basin.
People comfortable with that?
What is that? Just leave it as liaison?
Leave it as a liaison and encourage membership on the DRC. I know we are
Good with that.
all right. Okay. Grace, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks all for your input.
And again, acknowledging there are a lot more comments in the comment log. We will address them all in the text and in the log, so you can see where we've done those. This was a good discussion. We're a little bit behind schedule, but I think that was important to work through. Let's move on to what we are really here today to do, and that is to formulate recommendations as best we can. You and John started this discussion over the last few meetings. We've made some good progress on some and have some work to do on some others. And that work includes language. It includes decisions about whether or if to keep these recommendations in the plan and how to present them. I wanted to share a few thoughts on that. Before we do that, these are sort of our principles of conduct here. And I don't think I need to revisit this with this group. I think you're probably one of the most civil groups I've worked with in planning. I don't know if I should be disappointed by that or proud of you, but the dialogues here have been really, really professional and thoughtful. I appreciate that. The one thing that I wanted to remind everybody of is this concept of consensus, because we'll be talking a little bit about that as we move forward. Different river basin councils have dealt with that concept differently, but the planning framework describes consensus as a recommendation that you can live with. It may not be something that you would prioritize. It may not be something that you're fully behind. It may not even be something that you would advocate. You can live with it. And so the goal is to identify recommendations that all of you can live with as a baseline. Beyond that, it would be great if you can all advocate for the recommendations. That's a step higher. But the planning framework was very clear that the definition of consensus is not everybody raising your hand and jumping for joy at a recommendation. It is being able to live with it moving forward for yourself, for your organization, and the constituents that you represent. That's an important concept to keep in mind. That's still not enough, I don't think, to identify what consensus means on some of the things that are going to be more contentious. Well, today we're going to walk through the recommendations on the planning process, the drought responses that are done, those recommendations. The planning process are complete, not really. We have a little bit to talk about there. We'll talk about the technical and program recommendations that we began talking about with John over the last couple of months. And we'll continue to talk about the policy, regulatory, and legislative recommendations too. I'll give you a preview of what we have so far in each of those categories before we go on, so that you'll see where some of your ideas might fit and what we may be missing. I think last month you got introduced to the 3 buckets: green, yellow, and red, right? Any recommendation that's not clear and measurable to a benchmark needs some work. Okay, these need to be clear. I like the way John actually defined the word clear as being not ambiguous. That's really clear. The wording of our recommendations really needs to be clear. And when I think of that lack of ambiguity, I mean, I need to be able to read it as if I were anybody else and get the same message out. I need to be reading as if I was a state legislator, or if I was sitting in my home after coming home from a day of work, doing something completely different. It needs to make sense. So that's what the ambiguity means, and that's hard. And that's why we're going to take some time to get these right. And if we don't get through all of them today, that's okay. Okay. Also, just in the back of your mind, be thinking about, as you look at the lists of these things that we're making, how would you prioritize? Later on in the process, we will go through an exercise where we prioritize some of these recommendations. We don't have to do that today, but start thinking about that as we go through these, because I think it will help add clarity where we need to. Things that you have agreed to already, there's at least one, are going in our green bucket. It's going to make it into the report as worded. We're going to review a few changes today that we made in the language with your help to those. The yellow bucket, things that we've started to discuss, but doesn't have the full support of the RBC. And so we'll spend some time today talking about some of those and whether we want to continue with it, if there's some hope of consensus, or do something else with it. And something else doesn't mean putting it aside. I'll give you a couple options for that in a minute. And then there's the red bucket. The red bucket is a recommendation that really doesn't have a lot of support or traction from this group right now. There's really not a clear path to consensus. Very difficult for a lot of you to say, I can live with this. And so we probably would drop it. Okay. That pretty much clear. We've got some in all of those right now, probably. That's pretty simple. This is a little harder decision. I'm going to suggest we talk about this for a few minutes and then maybe take our break and then we'll get into the potatoes. Each River Basin Council has done things a little bit differently, and it's your discretion how you want to do this. In the Edisto, there were certain recommendations that the group did not come to consensus on. People who couldn't live with the recommendation as worded, but felt it was valuable to include the language of a recommendation in the plan with notes about its pros and cons. Because sometimes for decision makers, that can be as useful as saying the RBC is behind this completely. Okay, it's sometimes useful to see the debate behind the scenes. They took it one step further and voted on these, and we included pie graphs in the report showing the percentage of RBC members that supported the idea and the percentage that didn't, and then the percentage that actually. They felt that was fair. They felt that was useful information to include in the plan for decision makers and to convey to others that these ideas were discussed and deliberated. The Broad Basin took an entirely different approach. Okay, and they wanted the plan to be entirely based on consensus. So if they could not achieve consensus on any issue, it was dropped entirely from it. Okay, that was what they felt was the most useful way to address the productivity of this group. Now, before we get into talking about this, I think it's important to have some framework in mind of what you think is important to produce. And I would suggest that there's one more option in between those two that would include listing a recommendation that doesn't have full consensus, listing some notes about why it can be supported and why it's not supported, but not going as far as to take a vote and showing the level of support for the RBC, and therefore possibly isolating some members. Those are the three things I can see being useful coming out of these discussions. And I'd like to encourage maybe 10 or 15 minutes of discussion on this before we get into the verbiage, because we'll be doing some wordsmithing today. We'll be doing some debating today. I think it's useful if you have some endpoints in mind, other than just these buckets. The buckets are useful, but knowing that if something is going to stay in the yellow bucket, do you want to include it in the report or not? Is there enough debate, enough discussion, enough information on both 2 or 3 sides of an issue that you'd like it to be elevated as part of the report or not? So I'd like to encourage just a little discussion on that. I have an opinion, but I'm going to keep it to myself for now. But I'd like to see if any of you have any thoughts.
I'd be curious to see what folks think, what approach they would think would be more effective when it goes to the next level.
Yeah.
I want to see if we can get results from whatever we can get results from. But I don't have a comment there, but I like to design it where we can affect change.
So anything that goes in the plan will be action.
Yeah, make it easier for our legislature. Yeah.
To that comment, can you just talk briefly about the difference between a recommendation, which is really what we've been focusing on for the last 3 meetings, and the implementation matrix, and how those coincide and don't coincide? But I think people need to know that that's also where we're going. I think we've lost a little bit of sight of that too, even myself. So
yeah. So the recommendations are going to be ideas, proposals that this group agrees on. You are recommending this for action, and we would develop a prioritization plan for implementation and funding suggestions and things like that. Do we form other groups? Do we splinter, whatever the case may be? Those are things that the group agrees on, full consensus. It goes in the plan as a recommendation. These other things, if you decide to include them that don't have full consensus, probably wouldn't have an implementation. But you might suggest a pathway toward how the information that you gather, pros and cons and the information about them, could be used by decision makers, by the legislature, to carry the issue forward in the future. That's up to you. But we wouldn't necessarily prioritize as a part of our implementation plan, because it's not something that has the full backing. Does that make sense?
So every green bucket recommendation will have an implementation matrix associated with it.
Correct.
Has everybody seen those? You know what we're talking about? Give me some headouts. I feel like nobody had their Wheaties this morning. Okay? Y'all need to like wake up a little bit. Do we know what we're talking about? Is everybody like on board?
Yellow and red will not go in.
That's
Yeah, red probably won't go in the report. It's just
Yeah.
the question is
Right.
the ones that stay in the yellow just can't make it into the green. You want to include those not as recommendations, but as topics that were discussed, show different sides of the debate, and just maybe recommend a pathway for moving those forward and discussing them in future RBC phases or for discussion of the legislature, whatever the case may be. The Edisto felt that was important, and the Broad felt that it might have detracted from all the ideas that have.
So did the Edisto start out that way, or did they just get there?
Say that again?
Did the Edisto start out that way, or did they just
That's a
get there
great
halfway?
question. They were
through?
That was a good question.
They were the pilot base, right? And so everything they were doing was for the first time. They ended up, they got there. They couldn't agree on things, but on everything. They made a lot of good recommendations. There were 5 key topics that were discussed that they didn't come to full consensus on, but wanted it to be included in the plan because they thought they were important.
Would that be included in a separate section, like a record of decision essentially?
It kind of was, yeah. Take a look at the other plan. It was not listed with recommendations. It was a separate section on, I can't remember what we called it. But it was ideas without full consensus. But here's a description of what they were, concept, a list of ideas, support of these, lists of ideas on the downside. And then they actually include a pie chart, it's at 75% support. You wouldn't need to do that.
Well, the evidence though, I mean, you know, it wasn't first, but it was also had the most controversy.
Don't disagree with that.
You know, the various factions feeling very passionate about their viewpoints. So I mean, that's kind of where they started, and I can see why they ended up there.
Well,
What Kathy's talking about down there as far as recommendations versus implementation, remind me what happens to this report when finished.
so this report will ultimately be wrapped into the state budget. And recommendations from all eight
Through DES.
through DES. Okay. And our hope is that you all will advocate for it. That's what we talked about, these template presentations that we will create and materials you can create so that you can be advocates for the recommendations after this phase of the plan. But ultimately, you'll be wrapping this.
And some of it could be implemented just by DES, and some of it might take, you know, action by the legislature.
Yeah. Joe, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
I mean, I think he's captured it pretty well there. Yeah.
So the recommendations that you make, that you all agree on, agreed about items, you will prioritize those. And you'll lay out some steps that you feel would be relevant, appropriate, and achievable to implement those ideas. Anything else, you might just include as information. You talk about this, you have opinions, and it's up to you whether you think those opinions, however they differ, would be useful to other people who read it.
But if it's something that's just very particular and specific to the Edison, the Saluda River Basin, you know, that would be something, you know, a little bit more special, but really our general recommendations are just blended in with the others, correct?
A lot of them will be relevant. I'll give you an example of something with the Edison. They were talking about the mean flow versus the median flow in this river. And people had opinions for both of those. We can tell different answers. They weren't going to agree, but they developed a very good, clear list of why it would be beneficial and why it could be better. And they felt that exercise was rich. That's kind of what we're getting.
But I mean, one basin was median, another one medium, you know, I mean, you know, back and forth. I mean, you know, in other words, you got 4 or 5 different recommendations, and ultimately it has to blend into one proposal.
Right, and so maybe it's in the state water plan that some of these differences come out as well, because you'll be making policy recommendations on permitting, regulatory issues, safe field definitions and things like that. That may not jive with all the other rivers. And so that's going to be the art of putting it together into a plan. And that's why I think, I'll share my opinion, I think it's useful to include your ideas, sort of the pros and cons, things you can't read. I wouldn't suggest going through and doing a vote. I don't think that's particularly useful. The other stuff did want to do that. But I think there are enough topics that we're discussing that we may not come to full consensus on that are still worth putting forth in a plan with your debates. That's just my suggestion.
So
It need to be mentioned. I mean,
That's the question.
you know,
That's the
we
question.
don't need to put rabbit manure in this thing. It's about as blood as I can get.
So it sounds like the yellow bucket's gonna be a whole meeting of its own, whether or not it has any validity to it or not.
Or what you want to do with it.
Or sections of it, and it's just gonna have to be that, it's just gonna have to be, is there enough people that we feel that confident about it, that convinced about it, that it goes in, or it doesn't? And it's just, it sounds like it's gonna have to be, like you said, it's, are you okay, can you live with it? It's gonna be one of those types, and the yellow bucket's gonna be just that.
Could be.
Robert's been waiting.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, I'm like,
Robert,
So this has been a very good discussion, and I like number 2 with these thoughts. I would not include in the body of the report any recommendations I would only include in the body of those report recommendations for which the council has achieved consensus. However, if in our deliberations for recommendations, we come across 1, 2, 3, or 4 that there is substantial discussion of, I think there is merit in including these as an appendix, such discussions as an appendix, with the understanding that I don't think we should not view this plan as a one and done document. This plan should be viewed as a living document that, as the RBC continues its work, and I believe the framework has a process by which the plan will be regularly reviewed. I can't remember whether it's a 5 or 10 year cycle, but there is a cycle through which the RBC will regularly review and, if appropriate, update the plan. And for that part of the process, there is merit in including in this plan those discussion topics that the group felt were substantially important, that should be available for the future iterations of the RBC. And I see a second reason to include non-consensus items in the plan, and that is if our Basin Council comes up with a discussion of the minimum versus median flow, and Edisto has come up with a discussion of minimum versus median flow, and that comes up in 5 or 6 of the other basin councils, that suggests that is an item worthy of consideration by our resource management agencies. So I see 2 reasons to include in the plan somewhere non-consensus items that are substantive in their discussions.
And you're suggesting including those not in the main body of the report, which would be full consensus, but as an appendix.
That is correct, as an appendix to the report.
How do people feel about that?
My only fear with number 2 is I don't want us to go there too quickly. And I want to have most everything included with consensus. You know, I don't want that as an option. Well, I'm tired of talking about it. Let's
I felt you wanted to be a filibuster.
Right.
Yeah, I'm the same way.
That's a great point. David, how do you feel about that? Sorry, guys. Horace. There's your love.
Well, let's just see where it goes to.
Okay, is it fair? I love the suggestion of trying to get everything that's yellow into one of the other 2. Right. We'll work as hard as we can to do that. And
We all agree.
But as Thompson says, where's the report actually going to when it's done? What's going to be done with it? You also have to make it so the children in Columbia can understand it. You know, so there's no need to make it.
I agree.
You know, you got chicken salad, you got, so we need to be cut down the line, man. We need to make it.
I hear you. I agree. I think the best.
Some of this stuff we talk about is way out here for me. I'm just, you know, I fool with cows and chickens all the time. I'm not like KC and some of the rest of you that deal with it. So you have to make it so I understand it too.
Sure. And I think what we're trying to do is help ensure that ideas that may be really important to you that we don't agree on aren't lost, and that can be revisited by this RBC in 5 years, or they can at least go to the state as part of the state water plan so that they can see, as you said, in other basins, this issue came up too. And they came up with a consensus. Here's one where it didn't. And at that point, it's useful to have these ideas as to what are the issues behind it. But let's deal with it a case by case basis. I think that's sort of what I'm hearing. Let's work as hard as we can to build consensus on things. And where we can't, let's leave it yellow for now and figure out what we do. Yeah. And if we really feel like we're not going to get to a reasonable consensus or meaningful discussion on things, we'll put in the red bucket on part of this point.
I think there's gonna be things that we do come to a reasonable consensus on, we still need to fill that.
Say that again?
I said, I think even some things we come to a reasonable consensus on, we still need to footnote some parties' interest in something. I'm gonna have different interest in a,
Right.
you know, in a farm.
And again, that's where the concept of can you live with it? This may not be the top priority for you, but we look at your base and can you live with this recommendation? All right, we're a little bit behind schedule. That's okay. These were important discussions to have. I think they put this in real clear context. We're not going to get through everything this meeting. We didn't plan to. John even said, if you even get as far as policies, we'll get to some policy today. Why don't we take a little break, 10-minute break time? That's all right. Yes, sir. What time is it?
11:19.
Yeah, come back at 11:30. That's all right. We'll dive into the recommendations.
Very good. Just like.
All right.
Well,
We'll get started again here, folks. Lunch is being set up and maybe we'll work for, let's see,
3 times.
maybe we'll work for about
These 3 times are we do.
35 minutes or so, then stop for lunch. That's not fair.
Yeah. Then all these are. These are.
We can let, folks online, lunch is just getting set up soon. All right, so we'll work for 45 minutes and then we'll stop for lunch and then we'll continue in the afternoon. Couple things before we start going through these recommendations. One, I will assume that John would say the same thing. He may or may not, but let's put a deadline on comments for chapters 2, 3, and 8. If we can get any comments in within the next 2 weeks. So I think that probably puts us right at the end of September. Is that a fair deadline?
What was it, 4 and 8?
2, 3, and 8. Chapter 4, I think Catherine raised a good point. We need to relook at some of those numbers before they go published. So we'll extend that deadline a little bit. All right. Okay. We are going to get into the planning process recommendations, technical recommendations, and policy recommendations. In that order, I think the first 2 we may be able to make a little more progress on, and then we'll get as far as we can on the policy. Kathy, you want to say something about?
Yeah, so just real quick, Melanie had agreed to work on some draft recommendations related to surface water, withdrawal of permit use and reporting act. Man, we should just rename the act as maybe one of our recommendations, so shorter. But anyway, she has taken a lot of time to do that and develop some really thoughtful commentary for us to read through. We're gonna send it to everybody at the close of today's meeting, and then we'll definitely digest it more thoroughly at the next meeting, so everybody has time to look at it, read through it, ask questions. But we will probably touch on some of those topics today, because I'm sure we're gonna hit on a little bit of policy, hopefully, and in which case I will Melanie to voice some thoughts on what was sent, but we just got it this morning, so like nobody has it yet, so don't feel like you're behind by any means, but yeah, we're gonna send that out, so be expecting it in your.
Thank you for doing that, Melanie. Appreciate it. And like Catherine said, we will be talking about some of those topics in specifics today. So if a lot of your thoughts are going to be relevant to that, we can help shape these policy recommendations with some of your thoughts. And like we said, we will be coming back and revisiting some of these in the months to come. We're not going to finish everything today. Time is actually okay. All right. 3 types of recommendations you guys are making. The planning process recommendations, which I think are pretty well stitched up. We're going to talk about those really quickly. Some technical recommendations, and then this is where John throws me to the winds. We're getting to the policy recommendations for the bulk of the discussion. So the first 2, I just want to give you a preview of what we're looking at under planning process recommendations. There were, I think, 2 or 3 things. Continued funding for the planning process, building on resiliency planning efforts, and those are the 2 things that we worked on last time. Some suggestions in text, we've tried to incorporate that and wanted to just make sure that the revisions to this text keep this recommendation in the green bucket. And I'll just, because it's green bucket, I'm gonna read this. I'm not gonna read through all of these today, but because this is sort of a yes or no green bucket item, I'm gonna read this. This is to continue positive progress at the state level for river basin planning. The RBC calls for a state-led assessment of the current funding SCDES to support river basin planning. The memorandum should be prepared explaining the funding needed to support our growing population and critical activities, including the funds needed to implement the basin recommendations provided in the plans. Those yellow highlighted sections were suggested changes to the verbiage that you came up with last month, because we saw difficulties in watersheds. Are people comfortable with that text? It was in the green bucket last month with those corrections. Can we keep it there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys, we're gonna give you guys some caffeine or something.
I would take a yes.
Well, y'all don't like.
Hearing no objections, I'm going to assume this is a green bucket.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. This is one we also made in addition to building on resiliency planning efforts. This was half yellow, half green. We added a little bit here, and let's see if that was enough to push it over the edge. I'll read this one too because it's close. The RBC recommends that as part of the comprehensive planning process, that each local jurisdiction across the state consult both the resilience plan developed by the South Carolina Office of Resilience, local hazard mitigation plans, that was in addition, and the associated river basin plans developed by the RBCs for inclusion within the resilience element as required by the South Carolina Local Government Comprehensive Planning Enabling Act, as amended in 2020. Ensure that zoning, land use, stormwater ordinances, etc., are adjusted to support the resilience. In this case, you are recommending that each local jurisdiction within each basin take some action. And I think the suggestion from last month was that the local hazard mitigation plans be included in this.
We would say land use regulations. That last sentence.
Yeah, that would be.
That last sentence, land use regulations. Right. Oops.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. That's right.
Ensure that zoning, land use regulations, that what you're suggesting.
You could also, you could actually just say, ensure that land use regulation, zoning is a type of land use regulation.
Okay with that?
It's 600.
I think we're pulling it out. I don't know how it's that's one of the many ordinance subset. I recommend just saying something.
Whoever is speaking now, it is very difficult for those of us online to understand what is being said.
I can try to repeat what you said. We were talking about wrapping zoning into land use regulations, but there was an opinion that zoning is broader than that. They don't fully overlap. Is that fair enough?
Right, yeah, add the word regulations to land use, and then maybe delete stormwater ordinances, because you can't report them, there's other ordinances too. Ordinances are a subset of the, I would say, for the zoning land use regulations are adjusted to support resilience.
Could you say the same thing about land use regulations and stormwater ordinances? Are they completely overlapped, or was some separation?
Water ordinances, I mean, they change the ordinances to plans, because the plan is what mandated by the state that they have a stormwater. Every county, you've got to have a stormwater.
I mean, the stormwater ordinance is one of the resilient land use regulations.
Don't incorporate the land use, just say land use, leave everything else.
could just say like,
Change land use, not change land use regulations.
Can you just say that?
Yeah.
Land use regulations.
and like corresponding ordinances would be a bit broader.
Related ordinances.
So I would say like that's the biggest flaw or like challenge that municipalities have is. You have the engineer team typically writing the stormwater ordinances and the planning division is writing the land use regulation and sometimes they contradict. So I think the goal here with the statement is to avoid the contradictions.
Okay. Does that read all right? Does that avoid that?
So I have a challenge in the last sentence using the word ensure. I understand what we're trying to say. But I don't know that the RBC.
About encourage.
So I would suggest softening that we recommend or encourage. Yes, that is fine.
A couple agreements.
So get rid of stormwater ordinances, etc. Then
And then I would replace R with B.
How does that read?
like it.
Encourage land use regulations and corresponding ordinances be adjusted, support resilience. People okay with that?
So just to make everybody aware, this kind of requirement on local hazard mitigation plans. We just learned in the last month that we are not part of the Lawrence County local hazard mitigation plan. So we are having to go through a formal process to get in that plan. So the assumption that everybody that needs to be part of this is part of it is not a good assumption.
Okay.
So I don't know if that changes verbiage, but the reality is, I think we're assuming folks are involved in things that they may not even know they're not a part of.
I think I read that the recommendation that each local jurisdiction take these under advisement kind of covers what you're saying.
Yeah.
All right, can we move this from half yellow, half green to green bucket recommendation?
What is the intention of the last sentence? Consider adding hazard mitigation plans to what, to why, to how?
That was just a note that John made on our slide to prompt today. That's what we just did.
So a light green, not a full Kelly green.
We'll make it.
We're not gonna start.
Green bucket, all right.
Green bucket. Yeah, I'm good with green bucket too.
All right, I'm gonna go catch my flight. All right,
Remember, we're very likely prioritize the two.
that's true, yeah. Okay. Those were your planning process recommendations. Next were technical recommendations, and there is obviously going to be a lot of overlap with technical recommendations, policy recommendations. That's okay. We kind of pulled out two that we talked about and had some notes on, and maybe we can wrap these up and maybe not, but let's talk about them a little bit more. One is groundwater resources from a technical point of view, and the other is water quality from a technical point of view. You can argue that data collection is also a technical recommendation. I grouped it from today's discussion into our policy recommendations or ideas and prompts for recommendations in any of these categories. So we will get to that. And if you prefer to talk about that in this context of technical recommendations, we can do that. Okay. But let's talk about these two first. Okay. Groundwater resources. We've already talked today about groundwater not being one of the major sources of water use in this basin, although it is in other parts of the state. Are there questions about getting more definitive on that? Are there questions about needing to know more about that, vulnerabilities? Is there a recommendation that the group wants to make on that for this basin or not?
I think you can muddy the water. I think when we first started, we focused on surface water anyway. And all the river basins up fall up. I'm finding to do something.
To me, if you were going, I mean, like you point out, this is about surface water, the river basins, and I mean, the only reason groundwater should, come into discussion as an alternative, to using surface water. And in this river basin, I mean, it's just not an alternative. So very lower part of the basin, because we have a real aquifer. So
I think the one component of groundwater that nobody has a good feel for, that if we're talking about technical data that would be beneficial for lots of folks, is how many wells, not just commercial, how many wells are out there? Because if we've got 20,000 people in our county that aren't on us and aren't on the two municipalities, they are on a well. And a private well. And at times that could put a burden on that. So if you say, okay, those folks are going to have to come to the public supply because of the drought and their well has gone dry. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how many folks that could, what kind of demand that would put on. I can make an assumption, but I don't know. So, and I'm kind of jumping ahead because the next one was like, how many septic tanks do we have out there? Well, you need to know how many septic tanks. To me, you've got to know how many wells are out there. That's for quantity questions, that is a better number than septic tanks.
And there are some community wells too.
There are.
Out, right?
Yeah. Yeah, there's some mobile home parks. There are community systems that would never get to the registration level, and they're still there.
I'm just writing down notes here, so I.
Sure.
To Thompson's point too, then we also maybe need to ask the question of if anybody is going to be using groundwater as an alternative, what is our groundwater aquifer capacity and where? And if we don't have it really available, can you over withdraw, which would then affect these well users?
Well, also groundwater, how does that affect the capacity of that affect surface water? Because the farmers that, they might be drawing from the groundwater, but if they don't have that groundwater, they have an alternate source that's straining the guy. It's all related.
If it's a true aquifer, pulling from, it's already part of the past use area in South Carolina. It's already got the way to play the know what's coming out. Who's wrong? It goes.
I don't think we can identify the true capacity. We can fracture. That's why the well driller is charging per foot. Right?
I'm well aware of that because my private well at my house has PFAS in it, and so we have to go a lot deeper. I know those numbers. But am I hearing a suggestion that in future iterations of this planning, we do focus on some groundwater in this basin, maybe not to the extent that we have focused on surface water, but enough to answer some of these basic questions about, can we wrap our minds around the usage a little bit better, some of the private undocumented uses, and try to understand what the risks are of that water with respect to the surface water supply? Would that be a useful recommendation for future work?
I still have a hard time understanding why really all of the information. What we're doing, not to be a Texas, I don't know where, but potential these folks wells on dry. It is on, it's a big on, it's not how many wells there are out there, how many houses in the next 5 years. Doesn't have the capacity to meet all of those. So I mean, to me, it's just such a minor consideration.
So let me ask you, in these terms, it may not be a high priority. But could you live with this group, trying to quantify that a little bit better, just so it's, the vulnerabilities are better understood? I mean, is there anything wrong with taking that on in future phases?
Make sure where the growth is.
What's that?
And make sure where specific areas of growth.
And show you where they're walking. Absolutely. I've got a subdivision right now, that she's trying to debate whether it's better to put in individual wells or run a pipe for us to supply them. That's economic driven as much as anything.
No, they're just putting in pipes for us to supply.
Do what?
They're just putting in pipes for us to supply, but just. They're ain't thinking about the wells that are.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting discussion. I just did a quick EPA search on public water systems. And there are 20 or so public water systems in Greenville County that use groundwater. And they may be small, they may be mobile home parks, they may be campgrounds and so forth. But I think there is merit in looking within the basin at these small groundwater withdrawers. And Thompson, I understand your comment about we are focused on surface water, but especially in these smaller tributaries, in drought conditions, much of the replenishment of a stream may come from groundwater inflows. And so there may be merit in looking at groundwater in the future.
The Atlas has this map, has the public water supply wells map. But it doesn't have any individual property. There is
So the question is it useful to this group to have better data on this and understand how it could affect vulnerability, growth potential, and things like that?
If you have a question here, I mean, if you do a new well, don't you have to report it to somebody?
Has to be reported to DX if you want a new well. They put a sticker on it, it's pay I think it's $100 permit fee today.
And I mean, that's been going on for a number of years. So
Been going on for 25 at least.
And nobody knows where those are. So you asked me that when I see a layer where those are, it doesn't exist, does it?
We have location.
For all
information.
private wells?
Not for all, but I know.
Shape file.
I looked into that data and it's not readily available, and it certainly doesn't tell you how much.
We can look at like the specific areas. We
But
can
you
look at,
don't have an address on the permit?
yes. So we can look at a specific area by zip code and fulfill like an FOI request on that, but no, we don't have a public facing atlas layer or anything like that for all private wells in South Carolina, no.
But you don't have a shape file later.
Many of those
For you, though,
were
right?
installed prior to permitting requirements for private wells, so.
And that's just for a residential. If I had a barn and wanted to stick a well in.
Still by the permit, no.
It's residential irrigation well.
Those well cases that have the capacity of the depth of the well, the water level, and the capacity of that well. Stamped on that steel, they seal that case on any punch, what I call a punch well. I don't know if anybody is doing board wells anymore. Yeah. Not in this one.
So remembering that you'll have a chance to prioritize these, maybe this doesn't rise to the top of your priority list. Does the group feel that it's okay with recommending the future phases? I've tried to word it what I've heard. In future planning phases, the RBC recommends understanding the potential impacts of private and community wells and how they may affect surface water, especially during droughts, and or better characterize growth potential. Is that an adequate recommendation to this group? To you may prioritize it very low when it comes to that. But is that community/commercial. Community/commercial. Is that agreeable? Is that a useful recommendation? Can you live with it?
I've got one thumbs up.
Online. Yeah, can you live with it? Yes. Yeah. Top priority. Okay. That's what I'll do is. I'll let it work.
Be careful.
John will agree buckets in there. In case, yeah, I agree, these need to be a brighter shade of green. That's how those were. They look different than the upper Savannah ones. What's that? The upper Savannah ones look a little darker green.
It could be the projector.
Okay. More out.
Oh, don't blame it on my.
Just wait. Can't say.
Relative.
Did they look green in our meeting?
They did a little bit.
Yeah, you're gonna be color coding, the colors on all the plans moving forward.
All right. Save this.
So we've gone all the way down to the PMS color. Is that what we're working on the PMS code? I don't know.
All right. We are one recommendation away from getting to. Let's go to the policy recommendation. For this one, we have some lunch. And we'll do some policy. This was the other technical recommendation. Oh, what did I say? No. This was the other thing we began talking about. And it's, pertaining to what this group might want to do going forward. It's come up a lot. It's come up in almost all of the River Basin Councils. Is what can we do for water quality analysis moving forward? This first phase, really by the planning framework, focused exclusively on water quantity. But all the RBCs that we've talked to expressed interest in what do we do with water quality going forward. So with that as the prompt, do you want to make a recommendation that we create a framework for that we dedicate some funding to that, or request funding for that? How do you want to move forward with what the potential for this group's involvement in water quality?
One thing I would, and I don't know what the merit is in this, but I would be curious if DES would provide us some feedback on their funding for their water quality monitoring, and if it is adequate to support the water quality monitoring requirements of the Clean Water Act. And if not, then I would suggest the Basin recommend that the South Carolina legislature fully fund DHEC's water quality monitoring program.
And I'm not a water quality director, so I can't really speak directly to the funding for those program areas. I can go back and get information, but many of the watershed monitoring volunteer programs are based off of EPA 319 grants that come through. So I do know that, and then funding for wastewater programs is also kind of federally funded pass-through system. So that's kind of how that works. It's as far as my knowledge goes.
Right, but I'm talking about the monitoring required to develop the state's 303D list of impaired waters.
That is out of my wheelhouse. I'd be glad to have somebody speak to that, but that's not something I'm involved in.
But I didn't know, and if they check water, DHEC checks these creeks for water quality from time to time.
I think they only check the main stem of the Saluda, and when you have smaller tributaries, even major portions of the Reedy River, which are wider than some portions of the Saluda, those are not funded to be sampled, which is the premise of the South Carolina Adopt Stream program being or allowed, I guess. And so that's
a program that is established on water quality standards and approved by the EPA for citizen science collection. And the whole purpose of that program is to fill in the gaps of where the state cannot go out and sample on their own. That's something that we teach even to volunteers in the training as like why it's important for volunteers to collect that additional data. And I know that's something that's prevalent throughout a couple of states in the region.
Where's that data go? Where is it stored?
It's stored on a public online database. If you search South Carolina Adopt a Stream program. So it used to be supported by Clemson University in addition to South Carolina DHEC. Now it sits fully in DES's hands, just due to some partnership shifting. So the website is still housed on Clemson's website. The database, I'm sorry, is still housed on Clemson's website, but all of the information about the program is on DES's website. I'm happy to email a link to that, but it's a public database. All of the info is uploaded by volunteers, but the volunteers have to have participated in a full day certification process to be able to gather that data in accordance with the protocol, and they have to be recertified annually.
What's the role of the RBC?
So we're talking about the limitations of not DHEC, DES's sampling capacity. So I support what Rob said, that the legislature should fund additional sampling capacity and additional people to be able to go out and do some more sampling, because we've got really big areas in the state where volunteers are not sampling just because it's not part of the culture. In Greenville, it's huge, and Columbia, it's huge, and Charleston, it's huge. But when you kind of go outside of the major metropolitan areas, we don't have a whole lot of people sampling in those areas. And I think that it provides some pretty big data gaps that should be filled. Or maybe additional funding to get other citizen science programs. I'm not sure of the solution, but I think that fits into what Rob said, that we need to have more eyes on the streams, especially the smaller ones, because that's where you can spot the issues.
I agree, and I'm under the impression, correct me if I'm wrong, that DHEC's ambient monitoring program used to be more robustly funded and was slashed years ago, and never really got back up to speed. Yes, it would be interesting. I was going to suggest if there was a way to quantify somehow. This would be really hard. You know, what relative percentage of our water bodies are and are not regularly monitored through the ambient monitoring program. And yes, I agree with everything about the Adopt a Stream. It's an important program. It is limited, however, they do not test for everything that DHEC tests for. So there is that. But yeah, if we're not looking hard enough, then the problems aren't apparent. If I had to hazard a guess, if we were properly monitoring sediment, most every water body below the, our protected forested areas of the mountains would probably be impaired for septic, but we don't do that. So we don't know what we don't know.
Something I had a question about these trained volunteers that are out sampling these smaller streams and stuff. What kind of instructions are they given by trespassing?
They were given a paper, and then we have or the program has 4 slides or so about it. You have to get landowner permission. I recommend sampling on public lands or your own property only. But that's another barrier to gathering data, because if a landowner won't approve it, then you can't do it. So they're taught not to, but at the end of the day, they're on free will, whether they do or don't.
You can access streams through easements through road crossings. So that's where a lot of the
But I mean, not to get really off subject here, but it's just like the road that I live on. I got 2 streams on my property and both across that road, but there is no right of way. I mean, the county has a prescriptive right of way where they maintain the ditches, but you don't have a right of way to come down off of that crossing. I mean, you make stand in the road and throw something over there really back in, but you know.
They do that.
You can't get access to that stream without trespassing on me or my neighbor one.
What all will they say?
They sample air temperature, water temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, transparency, which is then converted to turbidity, and E. coli bacteria count.
Actually.
And I want to correct one thing that I don't think was quite accurate. I work closely with green energy programs and they will not fund water quality monitoring. They do not, they fund BMPs, project programs, but they will not pay for monitoring.
Well, they used to. My understanding, they kind of came to the idea, we've got enough data, we need to start fixing stuff, right? So, right. They're looking for fixes.
So at a high level, what I'm hearing is that the RVC could, if you want to advocate for additional funding and maybe cataloging where data is needed, recognizing that some places there's already enough or it's plentiful and it can be prioritized. Does that feel like a recommendation you want to make? Do you want to go further than that and recommend that in future phases you bring that into your deliberations? As you,
to me, there needs to be a nexus to the quantity issue. And from our conversations to date, the closest place I see that has been in the fish count. You know, the fish population data that was shared. So if there was a nexus to say reduced volume does this, therefore we think it's a volume, you know, we should look at the fish data or the macroinvertebrates or whatever that nexus is. To me, there's value in that. But that is the only area that I've seen where we've really, as a basin or as a council, have addressed where quality comes directly in contact with quantity.
Would sediment not also fall into the same category though? Because it's sediment loading.
And sediment may be part of that, and to me, the sediment loading gets much more into the having a rainfall and a surface runoff model developed at some point in time, which I think is absolutely a viable, you know, thing that we could advocate for if we don't have that. SWAM is a very powerful tool, but it doesn't do that to us. So.
Yeah, that runoff.
Say again specifically, sorry, I was thinking so much.
I can throw it out there once, we'll move back in the chain.
Jason, just stay away from cloth unless it's directly impacts one.
You're trying to include sediment.
You got a problem?
So again, on the second bullet, I am. I just want to go back and again, this is something maybe DES's Water Quality Monitoring Group could tell us, and that is this DES has established a series of water quality monitoring stations. They are supposed to monitor those regularly in order to develop their impaired waters list. The state does not monitor these stations regularly. They monitor them infrequently in some cases. And that's, I think, a starting point. Not to put down the citizen science. I understand the importance of citizen science, but DES's Water Quality Monitoring Group has the capability to perform a large number of chemical and physical assessments. And the reason the chemical assessments can be important is from a water quality issue, identifying potential problems for that relate to quantity and cost, or cost to make a quality water to be used by water users. So again, I would like DES's feedback on how well funded is their existing water quality monitoring program, and is there merit in the Basin Council recommending that the legislature fully fund the water quality monitoring program. And exactly, so that reaches meet designated uses. That's important.
And I would say the only reason I was bringing up the adopt stream program is to say that that program has to exist because there is not enough funding for what Rob was talking about. So it's a great program, but we shouldn't have to rely on volunteers to collect that data, because we should have the ability for those areas to be monitored by the state as needed.
It could be either or, but ideally they use both.
Ideal, yes. I don't know that it's the position of this council to recommend.
And that's the question. What does this council want to recommend, if anything, on water quality?
One more point on the AV monitoring. I encourage everybody to look at the South Carolina Water Check Atlas if you never have. It's a very useful tool. But DHEC has identified 3 types of ambient monitoring stations: the fixed. You can click on each one and see the layer. Ambient surface fixed, which is fairly limited. Ambient surface historic, more extensive, and then ambient surface random. And I think the fixed stations are the ones that are more regularly monitored. Historic, maybe fall, and then random are friends. Anyway. That's useful, but that's a great starting point to understand their extent of their ambient.
Make a suggestion and just see how this lands. I think some of what we're talking about is related to technical data, and some of it is related to policy and funding. Right? So I would suggest that maybe as a technical recommendation, you take it upon yourselves, if you feel comfortable, to recommend coordination with DES to identify what these data gaps are, what programs are available to address that in future phases of planning. Be a technical recommendation. The policy recommendation here maybe is everything else. Advocate for funding for all of these different things, and maybe we move that to the next phase of the discussion. Does that sound reasonable?
I would recommend we take it, and I agree with you. I think those are 2 aspects. I think we wrap some language and keep it yellow and return to this debate. Because quite frankly, I think there are folks on this council that aren't here today that have very strong opinions on this issue. And I don't want us to think we've gone down the path and not have everybody go the route that this whole council.
Got one here today, me, with things we get about along the way when we started talking about water quality. I can get our mission right now, perhaps down the road.
If we can get a handle on quality, it's a whole run for our basic. Get it funded.
Yeah, and these recommendations are for future phases. Something you take under revising now. Some basins have talked about flooding in future phases, even though that's not part of the but as part of the technical work, you can do the recommendation you consider.
I was under the assumption, maybe I'm just wrong, but I didn't hear it early on, but when they did this, everybody has said at the beginning to put on focus on quantity right now, and we will get to quality. So why would we be recommending anything that's part of the plan anyways? For instance, putting quality down the road at some point.
That's fair question, but I think if that has some support from the RBCs, you'd be much more likely.
Let me just I'll read it directly from the framework, so we're all on the same. River basin plans described in this document are intended to focus on water quantity issues. Water quality concerns, however, may be highlighted when appropriate in a river basin plan. Water quality considerations will be more fully developed in later iterations of the river basin plans. So the way I personally interpret that is if we as an RBC feel like quality should be addressed in some capacity as a recommendation for next steps, that's valid within the framework of how this is written.
I interpret it the same way.
So it's not like a black and white, you shall not discuss or think. It's more like, if you feel like it's worthy of conversation, then we can have it.
And again, it may not be a high priority for everybody, but if the group as a whole feels that it's important to at least set the stage.
But how far do you take that rabbit hole?
Right, which is, why we're in the yellow bucket.
And that's why I'm suggesting that we break it up into a policy recommendation, if it even goes that far, and a technical recommendation, where the technical stops short of just defining some of the data gaps.
I have a quick question. Before we leave this topic, just going back to that second bullet point and adopt a stream in general, I think I have a general question just for the group of what role we feel like as an RBC we would like to have in education moving forward, because we've talked about it. It's been one of the parking lot items, I think, for the past several meetings of just how do we engage with the general public, outside of this room, and do we want a recommendation that's geared around supporting specific ways to get, the general public or students thinking about water as a whole, or is that something you guys don't want to touch at all? Because to me, that's not even a technical or a policy, it's almost like maybe back to plan.
How do you implement some kind of education? And who's gonna do it? Where does the funding come from?
Right. Well, adopt a stream is an example of an established
Well, I think a lot of us do that.
But where Rob's coming from there, I mean, he's on the Conservation District Commission. And for years and years, the most of my line with Conservation Service and Conservation Districts, they did a lot of this work. And they lost their funding, or a big part of their funding. And to me, that's a very simple solution, is to go back and re-empower and refund these conservation districts that already have a mandate and already have a system in place, elected commissioners to do that job. I mean, I'm all in favor, of making the general public more aware of water and other conservation issues. And just say there is a mechanism, I think, in place that we could recommend be properly funded.
Thompson, when I first went on Lawrence County Water, Soil Water Conservation District, we were provided from the state colored books and all about water and stuff that we gave out to kindergarten, first and second, third graders. None of that, all that's gone away now. I mean, we do all we can to try to educate and support the kids, but all the extra paper that was distributed through the schools doesn't exist anymore. So that would be an ideal situation, that would be, I mean, I know we done got on another path here, but.
Well, I'm just saying, you don't have to recreate the wheel, there.
It's already there.
So is would a recommendation be for the RBC to identify the programs that are in existence and support them, or try to reinvigorate them, or whatever term we need to use and to make sure that as they tell their story, the RBC plan is part of it.
There's something along.
Yeah.
Before the South Carolina Watershed Atlas, DDS used to put out river basin water quality, whatever they call watershed reports. Right? Remember those? And they put them out periodically, ever so many years. Well, and in that, you had each basin. You had your maybe the water quality monitoring data, you had your point source discharges, a description of non-point source, you had descriptions of the watershed organization, you had all this stuff. It was very specific to your basin. It was a little report, a little kind of state of the state of the condition of your watershed. Then they made this beautiful watershed atlas. It's great, it's a tool, but they stopped doing those reports, those watershed reports. And they leave it up to the user to, and they said, this is now your watershed assessment report. I beg to differ. That is not a watershed, it's a tool, it's a great tool. I love it, I use it all the time. But I think this is a good solid recommendation we can make, is to bring those watershed assessments back.
I have two observations. One is that I think we probably can come to some language that is agreeable. And this is probably a yellow bucket item for today. Is that fair to say? Eventually, we'll probably come to some sort of meaningful recommendation, both technically and from a policy point of view here. The other observation is that you're all probably hungry. I am. So I'm going to suggest we put this in the yellow bucket. I've taken some notes. Maybe John and Grace and I can work on some language that tries to capture everything that we've heard here today and bring it back next month. Is that fair?
Yes.
I'm comfortable with that. If it was a red bucket, we'd never talk about it. I think it's worth thinking. All right, let's eat. What time is good to come back, Tom?
Usually gives about 20-25 minutes for everyone to get their food and sit back down. Quarter up.
Yeah. Well, what do you want? All right, let's get started again.
Robert already raised his hand.
What's that?
Robert already raised his hand.
Okay, Rob's got a question.
Robert? No. False hand?
No, hit the wrong button, sorry.
Denied. All right. That was a good discussion this morning. Thank you. I think we came up with some good ideas, some good text for some recommendations and some good ways to think about how we can present these. So now we've got an hour to rewrite South Carolina water law. And that's not true. But there are some policy, legislative and regulatory topics that we started to talk about. We're going to get into some more detail on those. And honestly, don't expect to resolve many of these, if any of these. And I'll kind of leave it up to you as to how much you'd like to talk about them in detail today, and then how much you might like to talk about this list of other questions that might lead to other recommendations. So I think there are 3, maybe 4 potential recommendations on the policy, regulatory, and legislative side that you've started to talk about. Allocation of surface water resources and safety. Revision of statewide water law, regulations, policies, and manuals. That's a fairly significant undertaking. And revision of stormwater mitigation and groundwater recharge strategies. And then there are suggestions for utility policies as well. Then beyond that, we have a lot of questions that can spark discussion and create other forms of recommendations. I'd like to see how far we can get in discussing some of these policy questions. If that's okay with you. For context, I'm sharing with you now that I won't read them all out. This is what the Broad River Basin Council came up with for their policy, legislative, and regulatory questions, or recommendations, rather. You can see they're concise, they're fairly general, and what I'm reading in yours so far are more specific, more detailed. And I'm not saying suggesting one is preferred over the other, just provide us context as to what some of the other councils have done, and we can come back to these if you like. Okay, the first one of the 3 major ones that we may get a chance to talk about today is the allocation of surface water resources. Talked about this last month with John a little bit and placed it in a yellow bucket. We discussed later when you consider recommendations about surface water law and regulations. So this kind of goes hand in hand probably with the next one, which is revision of statewide laws and regulations. But I'll read what you have so far, just so we can all have it in our minds and discuss what we want to do. Allocation of surface water resources. Safe yield is a concept originally developed. Let me just pause right there. The safe yield that we're talking about here is the safe yield allocate water from rivers. It's not the safe yield that we did the analysis on for the rest. It was different. Okay. This is the regulatory safe yield that is used to allocate water. Safe yield is a concept originally developed for reservoirs and groundwater and was later applied to streams and rivers. It is defined as the amount of available water available for withdrawal from a particular surface water source in excess of the minimum in-stream flow or minimum water level for that surface source, and is the basis for the South Carolina Surface Water Withdrawal Permitting Use and Reporting Act. This terminology has led to lawsuits and is not grounded in science, nor does it account for the flashiness of the river system. Keeping safe yield as a basis for our surface water allocations could result in additional lawsuits, dewatering, and or over-allocation. And then the group struck out this concept should be eliminated from state law and suggested that DES should study peer states and basins for a better determinant of allocating surface water resources. Okay, nothing heavy there.
I think that needs some work. That leaves out an important point. If I could just read some of the accessible recommendations that I submitted.
Molly, can I recommend if you're going to be reading something that you maybe come up here a little closer to the microphones? The vent is right here, and I think it's preventing your voice from making it to the folks on the line. You can just pull up a chair to the table if you like.
So, yeah, that is what the Surface Water Withdrawal Act says. But the implementing regulations say something different. And the regulations for safe yield calculations are inconsistent and violate the act. So that's what the act says that safe yield is. But the regulations specify that safe yield is calculated as the difference between the mean annual daily flow and 20% of mean annual daily flow at the withdrawal point, taking into consideration natural and artificial replenishment. In other words, it's equivalent to 80% of mean annual daily flow. So what this has done is taken this is a flawed regulation because it uses the highest conceivable withdrawal quantity, 80% of mean annual daily flow, tailored to the lowest seasonal minimum flow level of 20% of mean annual daily flow, and applies it for the entire year, even in those months where that minimum in-stream flow requirement is 30 or 40%. So it's been demonstrated time and again by DNR and others that safe yield, as it is defined in our South Carolina water withdrawal laws, specifically the regulation, is simply not available. It doesn't exist in most streams and rivers across the state for over half of the time or half of the year. So the recommendation that I put forward was to eliminate safe yield entirely as a metric in the South Carolina water withdrawal law and implementing regulations. And I do believe that this was a recommendation that the PPAC had talked about and entertained at one point. DHEC, I think, presented it to us as a, something they were considering. So then the fallback would be on minimum in-stream flow requirements. Really, you've got to, it's a lot to take in and talk about, but all of these things relate as to, you know, who falls under a permit or doesn't fall under a permit, who is subject to minimum in-stream flows, are those minimum in-stream flows sufficient? But just carving out safe yield alone, if we have this upper end that is not realistic and is not telling us what we have in the bank, then we shouldn't be, number one, allowing certain groups of users to take all the way up to the safe yield, not even accounting for that water that needs to remain in the stream to protect rivers, streams, aquatic life, downstream users, etc. That is not a fair calculation for allocation. So it's broken. Safe yield is definitely broken in our regulations and it's not consistent with what the act, the law itself says.
So there's a lot of good background in there, and I heard some actual recommendations. If you were to summarize what your recommendations are in 2 or 3 sentences to this group, for this group to consider, what would you say? I'll type these up and we can just
This isn't what I submitted this morning.
Mhm.
Sorry, I was so late getting it in.
That's
but,
okay.
it is
Keep
in
the
bold,
conversation.
and the recommendation says remove safe yield entirely as a metric in the South Carolina water withdrawal law and implementing regulations.
And in lieu of that, you had some other.
I didn't have an in lieu of that. I said remove it.
I thought you didn't talk about.
Well, in lieu of it, the you would be relying on the requirement for minimum
That's what I meant, yeah.
in-stream flows. Yes. And then there's a separate recommendation related to that. I could talk about. Put that down there.
Yes, you may. Thank you for coming forward. Okay. You combine that with one of the recommendations from last time, studying peer states in basins for better determinant for allocating surface water resources. The notes that we just got here are remove safe yield as a metric for permits and allocation, and rely on a better definition of in-stream flows, which would require some work. What are the reactions of the group? But I don't mean to be distilling too much. I'm trying to capture the essence of how you might formulate recommendations. You know, that's happening.
Well, I remember this is kind of where we started the discussion last time. That's how we ended up with the wording that we have in the yellow bucket.
With this wording here, reviewing peer states. So with the wording here, the reviewing peer states. Yeah, I had that understanding too, but that's probably the line of thoughts.
Is there an opportunity to really have some tight language around the recommendation and then provide some like rationale as to like why? Because I mean, I helped kind of formulate this, but and you did that, Melanie, thank you. This is so long, and to your point, we wanna make this easy for the legislators to understand, but I also feel like this is a hard one.
Yeah.
So if we just say this comment and don't give like, this is why, it's gonna be tough.
I, for each of the 3 recommendations that I put forward with regards to the act and the implementing regulations, I've followed each recommendation with bulleted justification. So I encourage everybody to read that and consider it. Their part.
Let me ask this, are there some counterpoints to these statements?
I have concern with removing a reg without having, that's not perfect, I agree. But I won't get a freedom caucus, a free for all. So, yeah, we can agree on removing everything. I'll take a little bit over nothing until maybe consider replacing. But if you remove what few checks and balances we have right now, that's scaring me a little bit.
Well, I'll just go ahead.
Completely remove.
Yeah, so these three go together really. The first one, I put out is to require permits statewide for all existing and new water withdrawals over 3 million gallons a month, including those before 2011 and all registered users. All users must be evaluated for reasonableness and must meet the Mountain Street flow requirements. And then I have 5 rationale bullets for that. Move safe yield, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rationale bullets for that, which I didn't talk about all of them just now. And then the revised minimum in-stream flow standards based on best available science to adequately protect designated uses and recognize regional differences. Because what our water law has done, and EPA agrees, it has established a new water quality standard that does not, that is inconsistent with the Clean Water Act.
So
I'll just read the very last sentence of my background. I have a page background up front in this document that I submitted this morning. South Carolina surface water withdrawal laws authorize dangerous depletions and complete dewatering of the state's rivers and streams. These laws facially and systematically violate South Carolina's water quality standards, the Clean Water Act, mandated designated uses, and anti-degradation policy, and the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of state waters. In short, these laws are antithetical to the letter, structure, and purpose of the Clean Water Act.
Okay, so
More.
Okay, yeah, everybody should take a look at that. I think we will distribute it to the group. And I think it feeds into this discussion and also the next one on water law in general, industry flows. Well, let me just canvass the group a little. Is this a topic that you feel you want to make some recommendations on? Is there anybody who feels that the safe yield policies right now are perfect as they are?
Let me say this, I mean, I'm agreeing with Patrick over there. I don't hear, any strong evidence here that we have something that we would recommend to replace the current road law, or I understand what you're saying, that the regulation that was promulgated probably didn't exactly fit the intention of the law. I get that, but to boldly go in there and start recommending that we open up the Surface Water Withdrawal Act with no concrete, precise recommendations to replace it is a real danger to me. And I'm gonna push back hard on that. If you're talking about kind of like the last sentence that we currently got, where we're recommending study, research, look at, and that's I'm all in favor of that. That we look at alternatives. I mean, everybody ought to be looking at alternatives all the time. But to just push for a very specific opening of the act, we don't have a specific recommendation.
I have 3 specific recommendations.
Sorry,
I have 3 specific recommendations. Get everybody
that I don't agree with.
Okay, all right, but to say that I don't have specific recommendations is not accurate.
Let's step back just for a second. You do have some recommendations. Your concern is, do we all agree on those, and are they concrete enough to open up the act? Right. So let's step back just for a minute and focus on one that we drew our attention to. I appreciate it. Is there anybody who disagrees with this statement in yellow? It would be wise to study other alternatives. Would you be comfortable recommending that on OPC to start with?
Just the yellow part?
Just the yellow part.
Just the other part.
In general, I would probably tweak it a little bit.
Yeah, our water plan needs to be consistent with our neighboring states, for sure.
I would recommend to that yellow that it not be so open-ended, that we suggest DES conduct a study and report to the legislature and give a time frame in 24 months or 36 months, something like that. Give a time frame, or else that'll just go into a bucket of to-dos that won't get done.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Kirk, but that would be established in the implementation matrix table that would partner with this recommendation. So we don't have to put timeline in the recommendation itself because it'll be in the matrix.
We can say by a specified date.
In the matrix though. So that's the preferred method for
I think
stating timeline.
I think you're right on that, yeah.
Okay.
The recommendation is that the action getting taken, the implementation
It's like when.
is when and how by whom.
Does that statement open it up to disregard what we want to suggest and do what Massachusetts does? For studying everybody else?
Don't use Massachusetts as an example of anything. That's gonna go down a rabbit hole, nobody's gonna get out of it.
I'm not opposed to it.
I'll just say this, with some of the regulations and all that, that I deal with the underground utilities management and, yeah, we look to our neighboring states for best practices. And, you know, we can go up to North Carolina and they're all right. We can go over to Georgia, they're better. You go up to Virginia, they're ludicrous. I mean, just, you know, way out of line. So it's gotta be, you gotta use a little bit of common sense when you start looking at neighboring states and best practices.
All right. As a foundational statement, this is okay, do you want to build that in somehow? To put some guardrails on it?
I mean, y'all do with it what you may. Like I say, I mean, this is different now. I mean, we're talking about big laws. We're talking about notification of utilities, notification of excavators. Yeah, but you got to figure out how to convert that to water quality, water quantity. You know, what are we doing with this river basin?
So I interpret this as looking at places that you might consider ludicrous.
Yes.
Say, hey, that's practice, but it's not a best practice.
Right.
We can learn from that. We can learn from Georgia that has some best practices, things that we can improve.
Right.
That's how I would interpret this.
So the way this reads currently, you're putting the burden on DES to determine if some other state is doing it better. Is that what an RBC wants is for?
So I agree, it shouldn't be DES, and I don't know if it shouldn't be, so we're all gonna do our RBC plans. That the group that takes these plans and works with DES and the other, the legislature and what, coming up with what the state water plan. That's it, to me, when that work should be hammered out. If we as an RBC feel like things need to be reviewed or addressed by a group, I think that's very valid. But to put it on DES, I don't know if that's going to yield what we as a state need.
May I make a suggestion that we include the who and the how and when in the implementation plan. And make this a suggestion that we the RBCs, we the people of the state of South Carolina, we the state need to do this. And then in the implementation plan, specify by whom, how, and by when. Is that?
My thinking on it was, you know, maybe. Problem is, I don't mind DES doing it as far as going out and looking at peer states, somebody, I mean, it's just a function of, hey, let's look and see what somebody else is doing. Trucks comes in when they got to determine what's better. You know, I mean, I wouldn't mind them going out and looking alternatives for allocating surface water, but they may not be the best group to determine the best practice.
So there was a report.
We could get, sorry to interrupt, we could gather information. Yes,
That's what I'm saying.
and, you know, and I've done that with other programs or legislative inquiries and things like that, where they wanted, what's Georgia doing, what's North Carolina doing? But to word it in the way that it was is something y'all need to consider.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. I would word it that, you know, the DES study alternative methods, like peer studies.
Just for reference, River Network put out a really nice report in 2019, so it's a little bit dated, but it's called Protecting and Restoring Flows in Our Southeastern Rivers, a synthesis of state policies for water security and sustainability. And I can provide you all the link. And it's a pretty in-depth report, and they looked at Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. And they gave each state a scorecard on these different things: water budgets, surface water and groundwater withdrawal, tracking, in-stream flow protections, interbasin treatment, all these things. So that's a good starting point. I think these kind of studies are useful, but I agree with the general tone of the discussion that, you know, we're here to make specific recommendations, and to just say y'all should study what other states are doing. Well, sure, that's great, but is that, I wouldn't put that as a, I don't know, that's.
Well, I think what we're trying to do is find something that maybe we can agree on as a starting point, and then build on that. If there are some specific recommendations that we can build on, maybe those are separate recommendations, maybe those roll up under this. But I want to see if there's general agreement on this as a first step in recommending that something else be looked at. I'll read what I've amended here, just trying to capture the different thoughts I've heard. The SCDES, the RBCs, or other to be determined in implementation planning should study peer states' basins for information and alternative methods for allocating surface water resources, reporting to the legislature by such and such. Does that sound agreeable in principle, knowing that there may be some more specifics that get rolled up into this, either as part of this or separately? Could you live with this if this were to happen?
Well, I would say, is the goal of this just to give the legislature a report, or is the goal of this to help inform developing the state water?
Good question.
Or is it to inform change in?
Well, the state water plan should do all that. Our RBC is going to roll up into what the state water plan says, and that's where recommendations on changing legislation will come to fruition. If they say that, you know, 8 out of 9 or 7 out of 8 RBCs believe this, that carries more weight, I would think, with the legislature. But at this point, I don't know if, you know, we say compile this information, go stand in front of the General Assembly. That's going to get us what our net goal is. And if our net goal is, we don't think the state water law is where it needs to be, we need to say that somewhere and let the state water plan developing group make that recommendation.
Do you want to include that language here to say to support policy recommendations in the state water?
I think that's the whole goal of the state water, to do that, to figure out.
So we don't want to just recommend a study to have another study.
Yeah.
No.
Not for that.
Right.
And you might not want to
What is
assume
that
that our,
email?
might not want to assume that our neighboring states have it right either.
Well, when you look at neighboring states, no, they don't have it right. I mean, like I say, Virginia's ludicrous on their dig laws. I wouldn't want that in the state of South Carolina as an excavator or as a utility. I mean, that's just crazy. But in the state of South Carolina, I look at it and it's just so open-ended, anybody can do anything, and then there's nobody to enforce the dig laws. And You know, it's just like, okay, we need something stronger, something better, but we don't need to be, let's find that sweet spot right here. We don't need to be over here and we don't need to be over here. So that's kind of why you look to other states. I mean, it's like I say, it's the best practices. You got to find the best practice for your state. And if you use other states as a guidance, then that's what you do. But whatever Georgia does really isn't for us. It's better than what we have. What North Carolina does is worse than what we do as far as lack of implementation. They have something, but it looks like an afterthought. And then when you get to Virginia, it's just like, all of a sudden you stepped into a communist state. And we don't need that either. We need to make sure that our state is supporting our waterways. And if we use other states to help us figure that out, then that's what we need to do.
It's a general umbrella recommendation, but perhaps we could all agree on that any of these policy decisions are based on sound science.
We always.
You agree on that?
Yeah, we get that degree on what science to know it. Yeah, that's the problem.
Well.
Yeah. All this information we got, it's crazy. But you're right, it needs to be based on something. What big based about?
Well, every state in the country is struggling with this question. How do you allocate an uncertain resource that changes every day?
How many states are y'all conducting this in?
This kind of planning?
Yeah.
We've done this kind of planning in dozens of states. And not one of them has come up with an allocation tool or process or in-stream flow process or tool that isn't challenged or deemed infeasible in some way. So you're dealing with uncertainty and trying to write policy around it. It's one of the hardest things to do. So there's no perfect answer, but I think the concept here is to look at neighboring states and even maybe states beyond your immediate neighbors to inform the recommendations that you make, learn what works, what doesn't. Can you get the best of the best that's out there and eliminate the worst of the worst? Maybe you've made some progress.
In terms of water budgeting, this river network scorecard gave all 5 states a yellow. They had green, yellow, orange, and red. So I guess yellow is next to the best. But they scored them the same across the board in terms of water budgets.
You should take that as a win.
It's a beat.
There are some differences in other categories. For example, Tennessee, they gave them a green for in-stream flow protections. They gave us in North Carolina and Georgia a yellow. And then they, further down, they gave Alabama an orange. So anyway, there's always some things you can look at, but, and it's, it's 5 years old too. I'm not sure how much all this has changed. But it's interesting. It's they wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. This is a good place to start. I know the folks that put this together and they invested a lot of resources in this.
I have a really hard time hearing over here. Who is this group that you're talking about that did this rating?
River Network, they're a national organization that bring river groups together, provide this data and information and support.
Private group, I mean, they're not a government group or.
No. Not a government group.
And just for a little historic perspective, when the state water law was developed, the folks that came up with it did what we're asking. I mean, they didn't do this in a vacuum. They looked at other states. They certainly looked at what Georgia or Florida and Texas did. A lot of folks looked at Texas as the way it should be done. It wasn't done. It wasn't a haphazard effort. A lot of people put a lot of hard work in to come up with something that was probably much more prescriptive than a law should have been in the act itself. So the regulations that were developed. Just had to reiterate what the law said because they were so prescriptive. So what we're kind of advocating is what people do when they develop a law. You know, you look at what's done and say, oh, we need to tweak it here and there. And they really either thought they had gotten it pretty darn good. It had to be negotiated. And quite frankly, for what was passed was the best it was going to be at the time it got passed. That and you know, it's easier to sit back 5 or 10 years down the road and say, oh, we need to tweak it here and there. But I think, and to me, the RBC should certainly reflect that. We know it's not perfect. If we want to say where we think it's really not perfect, we can have those conversations. But I don't want anybody here to think that, you know, it's better than, or it's not better than what we had before. Because it by far is better than what we had before, because we had nothing before. And we had lawsuits before with other states to get to some of these fundamental questions being answered. So I just, again, share that with some historical background that people struggle with these and have for years. They struggle with them in every state. That is why every state has a Supreme Court. That is why we have a federal Supreme Court, because people get it wrong and opinions differ. And then you have to look at what the law says. So again, just historic background. I've been listening to a lot of Revolutionary War history lately and developing our Constitution. So y'all may be getting some spill off on that.
No, that's great. You're exactly right, because I was around for all those discussions too. And it wasn't done in a vacuum. It wasn't done in 6 weeks' time. I mean, it was multi-year conversations. You know, at the time it was hailed as really forward-thinking legislation, because like you say, prior to that, all we had was old common law riparian rights, which was very controversial as to how they were applied sometimes. So it was a giant step forward.
Thompson, when was this done? How many years back? 10?
2010.
15?
2011.
2010 was the last change, wasn't it?
Yeah.
2011 was the last amendment. The law was first enacted in 1982.
So
That's just.
Did anybody participate on the Safe Yield workshop group in 2020? Because this has come before, like people are like, yeah, Safe Yield, maybe not so great. What happened to that? Anybody? Big ass. Until.
Where? At night. But I was paying very close attention to it. I would have liked to participate in it.
Wasn't that?
But they asked the wrong question. The question was not what's wrong with. What they asked the question, what can we do to fix regulation? And they came up with, well, the law needs to be fixed and we're not going to do that. So we can't come up with anything. And I was not a fan of that whole process, really. But nobody has defined safety like this, the 80% business. That just came out of a hat or something. I wasn't around in 2010 or 2011. But my understanding is that it wasn't, it didn't, what ended up was not what they started out with by any stretch of the imagination. Is it better than what it was before? Yeah. Yeah, but seeing, you know, with some of the issues that have come up since, have highlighted some of the very dangerous parts of the law that allow the dewatering of our waters. And I think everybody should be whole water users.
So really, the question to the RBC, and you've all seen the modeling results we've presented to you, is it worth, and is it within your set of priorities to recommend a look at the regulations compared to what other states are doing. And if possible, make some scientific recommendations for improvements. That's sort of what I'm hearing from him.
Yeah, but I have a comment from what something Austin said and what Melanie said. You mentioned in 2011, it's forward thinking. You mentioned science. I think everybody can agree with AI, machine learning, predictive model. We can all agree we need to get better data. And raw data is harder to argue over. The interpretation of it is where the science and the issue comes in. But if we can collect that data, you see what they did with the river model, it's powerful. So if we can advocate and collect really good data, when the legislature does get to that point, they have opportunity to make a better decision.
Two things there. You're right. That's more access to data. It's also those data centers weren't an issue back in 2011, and they take a lot of water.
Would it make sense to add to your yellow there, DES in coordination with DNR?
I think I'm the more we discuss this and the more I hear this discussion, just after the last meeting, I became aware of a safe yield work group that was convened, I believe, by SCDHEC. And I don't recall that we have had a presentation regarding the safe yield work group. One of their conclusions was that in DHEC at that time, DHEC's opinion, there could be marginal improvements to the way safe yield is determined, but the working group did not see that such improvements would make any substantial change. And so basically they concluded that we're good the way we are. And before we charge off in a direction and recommendation, there may be merit in hearing from that work group, or at least in forwarding the information, the summary notes to our group to see if there really is merit in pushing something like this. I have a slightly different recommendation on how safe yield is calculated, but going down the avenue of requesting DHEC to do a peer group study, I'm not sure that would accomplish much other than make another study that gets put in a bucket someplace.
Did we have a presentation on that at some point?
DHEC mentioned it, but they didn't go into depth about it. Again, it was very limited scope that stakeholder group was to look at the regulation and not the law, not in the context of the law. They kept wanting to talk about minimum in-stream flows as well. They kept bringing them back just to safe yield. We got to talk about it all in a package for it to make any kind of sense. So they concluded that because, safe yield is so dangerous with those users that are allowed to take it all the way up to safe yield in perpetuity, that because those users are a small percentage of the water use across the state, that any changes there would be relatively insignificant. So yeah, I would like a more in-depth discussion of that group, and all of their materials are online, but I don't think that is a good justification for making recommendations to a regulation that's clearly broken. Consistent with the Clean Water Act, according to our own state agencies and the federal. Yes.
So do you want to offer any thoughts?
Well, I mean, all that information is online. As far as us presenting about the subject, that is a bit complicated because we're currently under a lawsuit.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
That answers that.
So we can just talk about what's out there, but that would be it. Because I think it says she compiled the information, so.
I mean, again, we can point you to the information on our website. Yeah, you guys can review it, but as far as us getting in front of you and having a discussion about safe yield, sure, how it's calculated, that's under litigation currently. So I would certainly have to get that. Likely it's not a good idea.
I get that. Okay, so go ahead, Casey.
Are you able to disclose what the lawsuit is?
I mean, I would think that's public information.
Well, I would think so too. I just don't know.
There's been.
We talked about it.
Yeah.
You might not have been here that way. We can read for them. Lawsuits, I think so.
I'm just curious.
Let's
I'm not testifying.
let's make one of two choices here for now. Okay, so we can make some progress. Is it? I've heard some mixed opinions about the value of studying other states, other organizations to learn about ways that this method can be improved. I've heard opinions about trying to offer specific recommendations for improvement. My sense is this is still a yellow bucket task for sure. But I want to make sure the group wants to continue this discussion and not
red bucket.
Not red bucket.
I think it warrants more yellow. I do too.
Is that fair for now?
I gotta think on.
And again, I would encourage you to consider breaking things up. I think the tendency when we start to formulate recommendations is that they are the be all and end all. And as technical people, as many of us are, I know when I write a report, it's got 10 pages of caveats for one paragraph of substance, right? And I think we'll have that temptation here when we're writing our recommendations. I would encourage you to break things up into general recommendations like this, and then maybe some more specific recommendations that roll up to this. And I think you'll be able to find that you make some progress there. Okay. All right, I'm going to just make a note here.
Tom just thought he was going to get out of this discussion. That's why.
Yeah, 2 weeks to clear his head.
Exactly.
This is a fair way to put it. Yellow, we consider dividing into general and specific recommendations on the review of procedures and specific alternatives, if any. Fair way to put it for now. Fair. All right. Okay, we'll move on to something easy.
Presidential election.
Yeah, Kirk, that's reading that made you our leader today.
You're voting for me, you're writing me in, all right. That's not a job I want. All right. This is certainly related to what we were just talking about. We talked about this in last week, placed in the yellow bucket last month, sorry. Again, revision of statewide water law regulations, policies, and manuals. And again, I would suggest when we think about this perhaps as not one blanket recommendation, but it's probably a series of things, some of which you'll agree on, some of which you might not. I think that would make it an easier discussion in the long run. But I'll read what we have so far. The RBC recommends the SCDS perform benchmark analysis of our statewide water law regulations, policies, and manuals, including but not limited to riparian buffer protection, aquatic resource alterations, mass grading construction activity review, and the stormwater management BMP field manual. Documents should then be updated to incorporate recommendations from each of the basin councils and industry standards, providing examples to assist recommendations that are directed at municipalities. A lot in there.
A lot of stuff.
A lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Are there pieces that we could take out of this that might be?
And again, we're recommending another study. I don't know.
How is that first sentence different than the last topic in English?
I read it as a little more focused on, water law and regulations is exactly what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
These other things maybe are more specific to watershed type of management, riparian buffer protection, resource alteration and mass grading construction. Those are more watershed type of protective measures. Water law and regulations are exactly what we were just talking about. Would it be easier to focus this on the specific watershed activities?
I'm just confused with the mass grading construction activity review. Should it be more general just to I don't know, grading activities or, I mean.
Yeah, where did
Because
that,
what's a mass grading construction?
yeah, where did that phrase originate?
I mean, it's a real phrase when you're doing all of these, large developments, say, where they move everything all at the same time. Like Jason was one of the ones that brought it up originally because his family's in that business. You know, where it used to, you just grade individual lots, set the topsoil aside, and then have to stabilize that immediately. Now, we all see it, they grading off 100 acres, 200 acres, 300 acres at one time, moving every piece of soil on there 5 times. And while they're technically meeting the requirements of putting up silt fencing, go by there when it rains.
So Thompson, just to follow on Thompson's comment, yeah, the mass grading relates to subdivision or industrial park development where the entire parcel to be developed within the land disturbing activity is graded at one time so that you now have no soil cover on however big your development is. And then the challenge, as Thompson was saying, the challenge comes in, that site lays open. It could be months. I've seen it in the case of years. If the developer goes bankrupt, who knows how long it'll be. And the stormwater controls are just not designed to retain the sediment and soil from that level of open soil. There's an example on 385 in Lawrence County, in northern Lawrence County. It's a subdivision that's been open for over a year and has one house on it now.
That's right. I was just saying, why don't we just make it a land disturbance? Instead of it's mass grading, why don't we cover all of land disturbance?
Well, we could, but I think this is so different than, than just a smaller grading activity, a traditional grading activity would be, that it needs to be specific and then also, talk about the general grading.
I don't know.
Jason's one more.
The reason I was saying.
I'm talking, but he knows what he's talking
Well, I
about.
believe Greenwood, like Greenwood County, for example, if you disturb more than an acre, you've got to put up a silt fence, you've got to have an engineered retention pond. If you disturb more than an acre, so county's got say so on permits and what you can do, what you can't do at a certain point. So
Within 2 miles of right here, there's 150 to 175 acres that's been mass graded since November. And it's still red dirt.
So are we talking about, all this stuff is great stuff, but so we're trying to talk about water quantity.
Well, we are talking about water quantity because there's nothing there to slow that water down. I mean, it's coming down through there,
Okay.
but it does bleed over to quality because it is washing on, a lot of silt, that sort of thing.
But the silt also takes up storage in reservoirs too. And that's definitely related.
If this recommendation, something related to this.
I got pictures on my phone that I can show you 4 years ago when they did develop the side of my farm, what it looked like. What brought it?
They tied it directly to the cost of reservoirs filling up.
Okay, so.
Yeah, sediment reservoirs. So I'm trying to find what they said there. I thought that was a very sound recommendation. I think that a lot of these recommendations from the EDSCO broad, we can just look at it. Consider it leading them directly. I like and I like that one.
As you're looking for that, is it worth
Here it is.
trimming this down to focus on these watershed factors and maybe remove the broader water law concerns? Casey, you brought that up a little while ago. This is
Broad said, they said that our broad RBC should identify the financial impacts of increased sedimentation on reservoirs and water resources. Communicate the results to local governments, demonstrate the value of repairing buffers, sedimentation, and erosion control measures and other policies and controls that reduce sediment generation and transport.
and there was one,
That's what we're trying to get at.
and there was one water utility that did that, took that advice and conducted a study. And turned it into financial numbers.
Well,
No,
these are costs to address a reservoir out.
And that may or may not be the best solution.
Right.
But Robert. My recollection on this particular topic is that the reason water law and regulation were brought into the discussion is that especially regulation, the development is allowed based on regulation. And if the regulations do not specify or the reason the notion of benchmarking was brought up is the current stormwater regulations and do require a buffer. The question is that buffer, how do South Carolina's buffer requirements compare to other states, benchmarking to other states? Are they top notch? Are they median? Are they below? Is there area of improvement? And so that is why at least regulation was brought into the context. Perhaps water law does not need to be, but from the management standpoint, that's why regulation was added to this topic.
I guess where I'm getting confused is the title of this. The title is really broad. This is really focused on land management, right? Land management for water management. Is that a fair characterization? What this is? Yeah. Can we rename it just to start? Yep. Because I read this and then I'm expecting something much broader. It focuses on, which I think is good, something more specific. How's that? Land and water management laws, regulations, policies, and manuals. That ain't work.
Yeah, I understand what y'all saying about mass grading, but to me, it doesn't, one is you got to question what's a mass site? How big is a mass site? Two is all construction activities, when it comes to grading that are impacted, quality and quality of the stream or whatever. I mean, because a 5 acre site on a small stream can have some significant impact. So that's not a mass graded site.
So you're suggesting that any soil disturbance?
Yeah, I would just change it from a mass graded construction to land disturbance / construction activity review, or either land disturbance activity review. But if somebody wants to put an emphasis on mass grading, I'm good with that, because mass grading is killer.
Can we include it as a separate item?
Yes, I mean, I like I said before, I don't mind, say other land disturbance activities. I got no problem with that. I just think, and there is a definition out there. I don't know what it is, but there is a definition on mass grading. But I'd have to look it up. I'm not on that product. It's me. All of the folks that are in the business understand the difference between grading out 5 acres and mass grading.
Yeah, I mean, if you disturb, an acre and it's surrounded by set out pines, you're not gonna have nowhere near runoff. Suddenly, that canopy is gonna slow the water down, it's gonna catch it, versus 25, 30 acre site that's completely clear cut and mass grading. It becomes a 2-inch frog framer in 30 minutes. That water gotta go somewhere, and it's taking a lot of stuff with it.
I mean, I just share this concern from folks that are integrating business. I mean, they know they've got to do it, and they're so uncomfortable. You know, when doing it, because they see the immediate results of what happened.
I think what we're trying to get to here is, these land management laws, regulations, policies, and manuals that minimize surface water runoff and all the pollutants, all that that go with it, and preserve, protect, or promote infiltration. That's what we're trying to say here. We're trying to get us back to our charge of water quantity. Is that what we're trying to say?
Well, I think you're trying, I agree, I think you're trying to promote infiltration and prevent sedimentation of the waterways. So having land use practices that allow that to happen, or reduce the impacts of these land disturbance sites. Sort of how we framed it in the broad river basin, focusing on the loss of the reservoir capacity in order to link it to this charge. Because we all know that the development's happening and the sedimentation is impacting our waterways, but to get it to work in this framework, that's kind of how we did it in the broad base.
Is it okay to add that rationale, the very end, like you've done here?
Which part?
The bottom yellow, should focus on managing runoff, encouraging infiltration, reducing sedimentation.
Yeah, I think that.
I'm in favor of all of it, but I'm just trying to, point out, my ag engineer friend over here can correct me if I'm wrong, but well as I remember, if you double the speed of water, that increases the amount by 4 times and the amount, the size of a rock that it would move by 8 times.
Right.
So I mean, the speed that water is moving off of a surface is a huge factor.
So it's not just the runoff is generating sediment. It's 2 things. It is the water runoff, because we've seen that in highly developed areas, more impervious and all that, you're getting more volume of the runoff. The peak flows are increasing and the base flows are decreasing. We want that water to be kept in the ground as much as possible. So not just managing the runoff, but minimizing the runoff, managing and minimizing the runoff, encouraging infiltration and sediment.
Let me do a quick time check. It's 1:45, and I want to be able to wrap up and get folks out on the river as quickly as they can. So let me just ask the canvas a little bit. Is this something we feel we can get to concurrence on some wording? Thanks. Some careful wording.
Yeah, I think that at last they can.
Yeah.
I still have some fundamental, I don't know what we're trying to do here.
So
because
We gotta blow this up a little.
DES really doesn't have a lot of impact on law. They're just like everybody else. They can make comments, but the legislature deals with that. They write regulations that has to be approved by the legislature or their board. I understand that. Policies, manuals, they can tweak those all the time. We're saying we want you to dig into those to look at how it impacts. That's one thing. Laws and regulations, that's something completely different. Then we go into some really deep dives on some of these. I just don't know what we're trying to
Which have
really
control too.
really, they absolutely have more control on guidance documents and how they're going to do that. But I'm not exactly sure what we're asking for here, so.
So let's continue to work on it. I think some of it can become clear in the recommendation itself. And some of it can become clear in the implementation phase. So, okay, this is a broad goal that we want to recommend. We'd like to see this happen.
Well, it's a Saluda goal.
How it happens. It's a broadly shared goal. It's on that. It's in the broad.
And we're trying to influence state policies as well as local policies, right? We're trying to do both.
Well, we want to make sure that the Saluda River Basin Council makes a recommendation that you all can understand the purpose and motivation for, and then when it gets to implementation, what specifically you could recommend to get it done. Is that fair? Okay. All right, there were more, but I think we probably ought to call it there, all right? Does that agree with everybody? Does that feel like some progress overall?
Good discussion. Progress is all around.
This is not gonna take 3 or 4 meetings. I think it'll take a long time.
Can you send this out like today or soon, just like with the revisions that we made?
Yeah,
And
we can
then
do
I
that.
just, I encourage everyone in this room, like. It's good to have somewhere to start, and I think that last one really was more of a topic than a flushed out recommendation, but. You have it in you in the next 6 weeks, because we have 6 weeks till our next meeting. To try to wordsmith just one of these even and get it to Casey and I, and we can work with John and Kirk to get it in the next. Meeting agenda, just like. It's really hard to do this, right? Like if we have a better solid starting point for some of these recommendations, it makes the conversation go faster, and it's hard to develop these. Here in the moment, so you can, like Melanie, thank you so much for taking some time. I'll offer to do a meeting again if people want to do that, if people felt that was valuable to just kind of wordsmith and talk through things, but. This is tough, this is really hard, like this is not easy, and if we have a good basis, I think we'll have more productive.
Agreed. And really, I encourage you to think about splitting things up into sort of the general, like we did with water quality. Right, let's work on defining the gaps. I think you can read that, that's worthwhile. How you do that, what you do with it, those are more specific recommendations, and you can spell those out separately. They don't all have to be baked into one recommendation on water quality. It can be 6 or 7.
We don't invent the wheel. It'd be valuable to go through these Edison, Broad, or whoever else recommendations, and there's nothing wrong with taking their recommendations even almost verbatim if we like them.
I agree with that. I have a sense that you're getting into some more specifics than they did. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Comparatively, I think you're going to find.
Maybe some we can pick and choose for there.
Certainly, I mean, you look at the broad recommendations.
Tell us what you want.
Yeah.
Here again, these are the broader basic analysis recommendations.
Right.
And they're succinct there, but maybe they don't address some of the specifics that this group is talking about. So that's why I would encourage you to divide these up, come up with some very general recommendations, and then some specific ones that can roll up into those, because I think you'll find you're able to build some consensus. You know, much harder to build consensus on a page long or screen long bit of text, right? That stuff. All right. Okay, I'm going to skip over all of these things. Is that right back to John? The upcoming meeting schedule, I think Catherine, you mentioned it, there you go. 6 weeks from now, October 30th. Same place?
Church Street? Yes, y'all are happy here.
Halloween. People wear costumes?
Feel free to wear a costume. I will not be. I will be holding that off till the next day. Thursday's full costume.
You missed the opportunity to send an email to one person.
Yeah, we don't want to. I should have said it out loud. We would have sent something to John. John.
Comments on chapters 3 and 8, please, in the next 2 weeks, and then we'll finalize those. Chapter 4, we'll look at the numbers again, and get back to you on that. I'll turn it back over to Casey.
Great discussion, everybody. Thank you. Thank you to everybody online. I know it's tough to be engaged and be a part when you can get distracted when you're not sitting here with the group, but quite frankly, it's easy to get distracted when you are sitting here with the group. But I appreciate everybody's hard work. I appreciate everybody's dedication to this process. I don't want anybody to walk away from here thinking expressing their opinions is not extremely valuable to everybody. It is us all getting out of our comfort zone every once in a while. It's fine. Again, been listening to a lot of constitutional stuff, and they got out of their comfort zone constantly. But they came up with a hell of a good document. needed tweaking, we've got amendments to it. Our document probably won't be as long-lived and as relevant to the world as theirs was, but we're gonna try our best, knowing that it'll change. But I appreciate everybody bringing their honest opinion, and to share that and help make this, quite frankly, the best document I hope we can come up with. I hope we're a model for others. Robert, were you saying something? Nope, must have been talking to somebody else. With that, folks going out to the river, please be safe. Take photos, come back and share a good story. If you don't have one, make one up.
Take some water quality samples.
Yeah, water quality samples. Only improve the water, don't degrade it. I know there may say it.
Send it back, right?
But at this point, I would entertain a motion to be adjourned. So moved. Do I have a second? Chip seconded, I'm like already standing. All those in favor, right hand? All those opposed? And all we got. Y'all have a great day. Thank you very much.
Casey, bye, everybody.
Thank you, Nate.
Of course.